public infrastructure, public transport infrastructure. The National Party clearly don't seem to want that.
Is $30 billion on light rail really the right thing to be spending money on right here, right now?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, it's a multi-generational investment. Look at every other major city around the world. They invest in their public and public transport infrastructure. And yes, it happens over decades. In the UK, where the member has previously lived, they're still building their underground rail network over 100 years after they started it.
Does he think someone on the average wage is paying too much tax when their income has grown less than inflation for the last 2.5 years?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to make announcements on tax today.
Can the Prime Minister just answer, does he agree that someone on the average wage is paying too much tax or not?
Mr. Speaker, what the government will not be doing is cutting taxes for the highest income earners, which is the National Party's policy.
Not the policy. Isn't it the case that the Prime Minister has changed, that it's the same old Labor, addicted to spending and just can't get anything done?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, the member keeps going on about wanting to get things done. He doesn't seem to have too many ideas about what it is that he actually wants to get done.
Question number 4 in the name of Angie Warren-Clark.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Social Development and Employment and asks, what announcements has she made to support NGOs and those impacted by the floods and Cyclone Gabrielle?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Carmel Sepuloni.
Mr. Speaker, last week I announced an initial $11.5 million community support package to help NGOs and the community sector respond to the adverse weather events. The package consists of $4 million for providers to ensure they can meet increased demand and support well-being of their staff and volunteers due to flooding and cyclone, $1 million to replenish stocks at food banks currently experiencing high demand, $2 million of grants for community groups to support flood response, $4 million expansion of the scope of community connectors to support Auckland and impacted regions' flood response efforts, and $500,000 ring-fenced funding to respond to the needs of disabled people. Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance have stated, the government's support for flood-affected communities will be ongoing, and this initial package of support will help our NGOs get through the immediate response.
Supplementary. How much money has been allocated from the package thus far?
Mr. Speaker, MSD began communicating with NGOs and community organisations on the package last week and started taking applications on Friday. As of 9 a.m. Tuesday, the 21st of February, $2.27 million had been committed to NGOs through this package. MSD are working hard to process applications as quickly as possible, and I anticipate more money will be in the hands of NGOs and community organisations by the end of this week. The package has come as welcome relief to many, and I ask any NGOs who need support to contact MSD to see if they qualify for support. I'd like to thank all of the NGOs and community volunteers who have stood up and served their communities so well in these very difficult times.
What support has been provided to individuals who need help following these weather events?
Mr. Speaker, as a national state of emergency is in effect, civil defence payments are available for people in the affected regions. The civil defence payments are not income or asset tested. They are for people who need immediate and essential support for items such as food, clothing and bedding. So far, there has been $36.599 million paid out to over 72,000 people in need. Yesterday, $3.7 million was paid out to 8,067 people. This included $1.7 million paid out in support to people in Hawke's Bay and $585,000 to people in Gisborne.
Why is the support to NGOs and individuals so important?
Mr. Speaker, there are many NGOs and community organisations and iwi organisations who have sprung into action to serve their communities. I've witnessed this firsthand in Auckland with organisations at the beginning of the weather events using their own resources and initiative to support the community. This funding will help them replenish their resources and prepare them for the upcoming support that will be required by whānau affected by these events. Likewise, the civil defence payments are able to help individuals in whānau with their immediate costs. Many have lost homes, possessions and livelihoods, and these payments are there to be accessed in their time of need. As the Minister for Finance has stated, this is just the beginning of our response. As we move into recovery, we will assess what other support may be needed.
Question number 5, David Seymour.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and may I acknowledge the people of the Canterbury region on this 12th anniversary of a terrible tragedy. My question is to the Prime Minister and reads, does he stand by all his government's statements and actions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes.
Supplementary. How much tax is his government forecast to collect this year, and how much more tax is that compared with the $86 billion collected in the last year pre-COVID?
Oh, Mr Speaker, if the member wants that specific information, he'll find that in the budget documents.
Supplementary. Does the Prime Minister not know?
Mr Speaker, I haven't memorised the entire budget, no.
Wouldn't it be important to understand that his government is taxing $118 billion off New Zealanders, $32 billion per year more than just 4 years ago?
Mr Speaker, I think I welcome the opportunity to set out for the member that our government is actually taking less tax out of the economy as a proportion of the economy than when we became the government.
Supplementary. Which option does the Prime Minister prefer most for funding the recovery from the cyclones? Tax people more now, borrow now and tax later, or reprioritise current spending?
Mr Speaker, I think those kind of debates are premature because we don't yet know what the true extent of the damage is or the true cost of the damage is. Responsible governments make sure that they consider all of the options around how to pay for a natural disaster such as this, as the previous government did after the Canterbury earthquakes. They canvassed a range of options before deciding how to pay for it. That is what responsible governments do.
Supplementary. Is the Prime Minister aware that when his government came to office, government expenditure was 27% of GDP? It's now 35%, and if tax as a percentage of GDP has reduced, then the government must have increased the deficit by more than 8% of GDP. How does any of that add up?
Mr Speaker, it got up to about 34% under National, and it's currently lower than it was under the peak of spending during National's time in government after the global financial crisis.
Does the Prime Minister accept that government spending, especially deficit government spending, puts pressure on interest rates, meaning people's mortgages cost more than they otherwise would?
Mr Speaker, one of the reasons I'm really proud of the financial track record of this government is that prior to this most recent series of events, which of course will change things, we were on track to get back into surplus faster than the last government did after the global financial crisis. I note that the member and his party voted for every single budget during their term in government.
Question number 6, Nicola Willis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, does he think New Zealanders suffering a cost of living crisis should pay more tax? And why won't he rule out introducing a new tax to help pay for the Cyclone Gabrielle clean-up?
The Honourable Grant Robertson.
Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that low and middle income New Zealanders are doing it tough right now with cost of living pressures, and that's why the government has put in place a range of support for them to be able to help meet the cost of living. No decisions have been taken to change any tax settings further than what the government has already done. I do think that New Zealanders in this position should continue to be supported by the government through this time. In light of the fact that we have had just the third ever national state of emergency declared in New Zealand's history, and that many people's homes, livelihoods, businesses and lives have been devastated, it is the responsible thing to do to take the time to consider the options for how we will pay for the government's share of the recovery.
Why is the Minister's first port of call to fund the rebuild another new tax and not dumping pet political projects like the $30 billion light rail commitment?
Mr Speaker, in answer to the first part of the member's question, it's not. In answer to the second part of the question, as discussed at the Finance and Expenditure Committee earlier today, there are a range of options for how to finance the future contribution that the government will need to make. The responsible thing for a government to do is be able to work through those options while we work out just how big the bill will be.
Well, does he stand by his commitment in 2021 that, quote, Labor's policy was clear that we would not introduce any new taxes?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in my earlier answer, no decisions have been taken to do anything other than the tax policy that the government has. However, what responsible governments do in this situation is assess options. For instance, Bill English on the 4th of March 2011 received a report entitled Funding the Earthquake Recovery, Levies and Other Potential Funding Options, which begins, this report responds to your request for advice on options for funding the earthquake recovery, including a dedicated earthquake levy, Mr. Speaker. It's a pity the member doesn't share the responsible approach of her former boss.
Isn't it an indictment on the Minister's economic management that faced with a rebuild following a natural disaster, you won't rule out smashing Kiwis with a new tax, something the previous government did not do following the Canterbury or Kaikoura earthquakes?
Mr. Speaker, as I note, on the 4th of March, just a week or two after the Canterbury earthquakes, the then Finance Minister, Bill English, got advice on whether or not there should be a levy. As I have already stated today, we have not taken decisions. We are in exactly the same position of assessing the scale and working out how the government will pay for it. It is what a responsible government would do. It's what Bill English would do. Clearly the member's not in that category.
How can he possibly justify speculating about new taxes when New Zealanders up and down the country are feeling anxious and squeezed by a prolonged cost of living crisis, which today has seen interest rates rise yet again for the 10th time in 18 months?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in my primary answer, I am acutely aware of the cost of living pressures that are facing particularly low and middle income households. That is the reason why this government has stepped up time and time again to support those people through increases to the family tax credit, through the cost of living payment, to the increases we've made to main benefits, to the winter energy payment. Every single one of those opposed by the National Party.
How much higher does he think New Zealanders' mortgage rates might climb following today's lift in the official cash rate? And does he agree that this is not the time to impose yet another new tax on an already fragile economy?
Speaker, what I think this is the time for is for the government to work through the full costs of a significant natural disaster that has impacted many regions of New Zealand. What I think is that, as Bill English did, we should assess all of the options that are in front of us. Mr. Speaker, there are people out there today who are cleaning away the silt out of their houses and out of their businesses. They want to know that New Zealanders have a government that takes that seriously, doesn't turn it into a cheap political point scoring, but actually assesses the options in front of us.
Has he been advised how many New Zealanders will move from a mortgage with a 2 or 3% interest rate to a mortgage with a 6 or 7% interest rate over the next 6 months? And is it really his position that in this environment they should be braving a tax hike as well?
Mr. Speaker, in answer to the second part of that question, I repeat all of the answers that I've given. No decisions have been taken on that. But just as a previous government, of which the member was very close to, assessed their options, we are assessing our options. Our balance sheet is strong. We have the ability to use the fiscal headroom. We will look at reprioritisation and we will assess other options. It would be irresponsible to do otherwise, and I can't understand why the member is so committed to trashing Bill English's legacy.
Why won't the minister just rule it out? And isn't the case that instead of smashing Kiwis with a new tax, he could comfortably repay the rebuild of the East Coast if the government simply scrapped their own political pet projects like Auckland Light Rail?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know how the member knows what the cost of rebuilding the east coast of the North Island, the Hawke's Bay, Northland, Coromandel, Auckland, the Wairarapa and the Tararua regions and all those affected are. That is the very work that is underway right now. What we've done is stepped up with more than $350 million immediately to support that. There will be more support, Mr. Speaker, and we'll take the responsible approach of working out how best to pay for that, as previous governments have done.
Order. Question number 7, Shannon Albert.
E te māngai o te whare tēnā koe. Question to the Minister of Transport. What reports has he received about progress on repairing transport network following the recent extreme weather events?
The Honourable Michael Wood.
Mr. Speaker, I'm receiving regular reports about the state of our transport network in the wake of the devastating flooding and Cyclone Gabrielle. I'm advised that key routes in most affected regions, including critical parts of State Highway 2 in Napier and Tairāwhiti and critical freight routes in Northland, are now open once again. However, the damage to our road and rail networks is substantial in a number of sections of State Highway 2 and 5, as well as the Brynderwyns on State Highway 1 remain closed. As at 21 February, there are fewer than 10 sections of State Highway with full or partial closures. We know there's a long road ahead of us to repair our transport network, and the government is committed to supporting communities through this, which is why we've announced $250 million of support for the NLTF to fund urgent repairs and maintenance in the coming weeks. I want to put on record and thank all of the roading crews from Waka Kotahi contractors all around the country who have done an incredible job over the past couple of weeks to reconnect communities and supply chains.
Supplementary. What reports has he received about repairs underway on transport networks in Te Tairāwhiti?
Mr. Speaker, the situation is a dynamic one in Tairāwhiti. Prior to question time, I was advised that State Highway 2 from Aportiki to Gisborne, as well as Gisborne to Wairoa, were both now open to the public. However, as of 1:50, a major slip has once again closed State Highway 2 between Aportiki and Gisborne, which goes to demonstrate the ongoing challenging situation that our roading contractors are facing. Preparations are underway for a 90-metre long Bailey Bridge to be installed on State Highway 35 near Tokomaru Bay to replace a severely damaged Hikowai Bridge. I'm advised that of yesterday, around 50 local roads remain closed or damaged across the region. We do know that emotions are high across the region in the wake of what has been a traumatic event, particularly where communities are isolated, and I do want to assure people that Waka Kotahi, councils and contractors are working around the clock to restore access.
Supplementary. What reports has he received about the reinstatement of transport links in the Hawke's Bay?
Mr. Speaker, key routes around the Hawke's Bay have started to open again, including the Napier to Hastings Expressway and State Highway 51 between Napier and Clive. I understand that the expressway in particular is very busy, and I would encourage motorists to please be patient. As of yesterday, the two key routes that remain closed are State Highway 2 Napier to Wairoa and State Highway 5 Napier to Taupo. And I'm advised that they are likely to remain closed for some time while assessment of the road and bridge conditions continues. A Bailey Bridge is also expected to be installed at the Waikari River north of Napier shortly. Contractors are also working on State Highway 38 from Murupara to Wairoa to restore access to the town from the west, and it is expected to be open to the public in coming days.
What reports has he received about the restoration of transport connections in Northland?
Mr. Speaker, Northland has also been severely affected by both weather events over recent weeks. I'm advised that State Highway 1 is closed at the Brynderwyns due to a range of severe slips. However, over the past week, 2 detours through Waipu and Dargaville for light and heavy vehicles, respectively, have been reopened.
Question number 8, Chris Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Police. Does he stand by his statement that, quote, "what I'd say to the gangs, get your bloody patches off," end quote? If so, has he seen reports of how many gang members have taken their patches off?
The Honourable Michael Wood.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Police, for the first part of the question, he stands by his full statement on Sunday that, quote, "get your bloody patches off, go and get a whole lot of wheelbarrows and shovels and start helping people, as opposed to adding to already super high levels of stress." He also noted that he would go back and be assured that there was a strong police presence to deal with community concerns. Since then, I'm able to confirm to the House that police will have a total of 145 additional staff deployed across the Eastern District, that police report that crime in the area is within a normal range for the Eastern District. However, this is obviously amplified for a community that is feeling very vulnerable. To that end, police have had high visibility and a strong reassurance focus in addition to responding to calls from the public. For example, in the 24-hour period to 7 a.m. this morning, police conducted 565 prevention activities, including reassurance patrols and proactive engagements with storm-hit communities. Police staff are prioritising taskings to contact those also from the uncontactable list, which I'm sure we all understand is one of the most pressing needs at this time. In answer to the second part of the question, no.
Point of order, Nicole McKee.
Sorry, mistake.
Supplementary, Chris Bailey.
What does it say about this government's record on law and order that the police minister has been reduced to begging gang members to be nice? And isn't it time to send in our armed forces to assist police like Napier Mayor Kirsten Wise has been asking for?
Mr Speaker, I reject the premise of the member's question. As I responded in my primary answer on behalf of the Minister of Police, police have been conducting a significant amount of work to provide reassurance and support to the people of storm-hit regions at a time of extreme stress. New Zealand Defence Forces continue to play an important role in the region, but will stand by the police who have the expertise to work with communities and provide that reassurance at a difficult time. Will stand by them and not further make the situation difficult by whipping up hysteria.
Nicole McKee, supplementary.
What does he say to Grant Porter from Napier, who told the media, quote, "The gangs are coming in, or looters in general, they're threatening people, stealing their stuff. We are very scared. People are very scared," end quote. And does he believe it's important to believe the victims of crime?
Mr Speaker, I absolutely believe that it is critical to believe the victims of crime, and that is why it is exceptionally important at all times, but particularly in a time of extreme distress for many people, such as now in the storm-hit regions, that we adequately support police to be able to get out on the ground, to prevent crime and provide reassurance to the communities. In my primary answer, I've outlined the significant amount of police work that police have underway in that area. We'll continue to support police in that operational response, and our government will also continue to support police by building their numbers, which have increased by 1,700 since we came to office.
Supplementary. Who is correct? Is it the Napier Mayor and the Hawke's Bay Chamber of Commerce CEO who say they need armed forces? Or is it the Police Commissioner who is gaslighting locals by telling them that they don't know what's going on and that he knows better?
Mr Speaker, I believe that the comments of the member in respect of the Commissioner's approach to these issues are unhelpful, intemperate and incorrect. The Police Commissioner has been working closely with the Eastern District to ensure that there are sufficient officers on the ground, including 145 additional officers who have been deployed into that community. No one, including the Minister, the Police Commissioner or local police, have done anything to reject or downplay people's concerns about their safety. They have been putting resources in to provide further reassurance. Where crime occurs, police are on the ground to support communities. But as I have also said in the primary answer to this question, police report that levels of crime are within a normal range. No crime is acceptable, and this time it is more stressful for communities. So we will continue to work to provide that reassurance. And I would just urge all members of the House to support police in doing that job and not to create a climate of hysteria that will add further to the distress of people in an already difficult situation.
Question number 9, the Honourable Opatul William Seal.
Mr Speaker, the question is to the Minister for Emergency Management. What assistance has NEMA coordinated to support local responses to Cyclone Gabrielle?
The Honourable Kieran McAnulty.
Mr Speaker, under our emergency management system, local leadership of responses is critical to ensuring everything we do is informed by the situation on the ground. In several parts of the North Island, the situation remains incredibly difficult for the communities affected in the wake of Cyclone Gabrielle. The National Emergency Management Agency's role is to ensure local responses are getting what they need. Under a state of national emergency, as was declared on the 14th of February and extended on Monday, NEMA has the ability to direct and prioritise nationwide resources. This includes bringing in extra support from the New Zealand Defence Force, Police, Fire and Emergency New Zealand and other agencies as required. This has involved the provision of critical supplies, logistics and specialist skills to aid the local response and recovery. As many of us said in the House yesterday, I want to thank all those who are working tirelessly to support the communities who were hit by Cyclone Gabrielle.
Supplementary. Thank you, Minister. Can I ask, what support has been coordinated by NEMA to local mayoral relief funds?
Mr Speaker, the National Emergency Management Agency has been advising the government on contributions to mayoral and regional relief funds. These funds are used to provide immediate short-term support in areas affected by emergencies. Once approved, NEMA coordinates the distribution of government contributions to these funds. So far, in response to the cyclone, the government has contributed $3.7 million to mayoral and regional relief funds. These contributions reflect that local communities and councils understand where the immediate needs are and how to best help families, community organisations and marae. They play a small but important part of the government's total support package.
Mr Speaker, supplementary. To the Minister, what support has been provided by the National Crisis Management Centre?
Mr Speaker, the National Crisis Management Centre, which is housed under the Beehive, has provided leadership of central government agencies and the local civil defence groups working on the ground. Its role is critical in managing the array of priority tasks that are required to support the emergency response. It is staffed by emergency management professionals who link in with representatives of the core agencies who are also represented. I am consistently impressed by the tireless work and dedication of those professionals and how they go about their tasks to protect New Zealanders in the wake of the cyclone.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker. Again, can I ask the Minister, can he tell us what other support does NEMA provide to local emergency responses?
Mr Speaker, NEMA has surged its staff to impacted regions to support the response to the cyclone as well as the response to the Auckland floods several weeks earlier. They have helped with activities like planning, logistics and getting information out to the public. NEMA is also providing expert capability to support local responses through fly-in emergency management assistance teams. They provide specialist emergency management capabilities to assist and support local incident management teams working in the affected areas. These teams are made up of specialist emergency managements with a mix of attributes, skills and experience to go wherever they are required. In response to Cyclone Gabrielle, they have been deployed to Napier, Hastings, Wairoa and Gisborne to help boost those local responses, having been already deployed to Auckland earlier.
Question number 10, Erica Stanford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Education, on what date was she provided with the Term 3 2022 attendance data by the Ministry of Education, and why was the data not released publicly until just yesterday?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Jan
Mr Speaker, to the first part of the question, my office received the final copy of the Term 3 attendance report from the Ministry of Education on the 14th of December. Additional data was then sent to my office on the 20th of December. And to the second part of the question, the Ministry of Education are responsible for the release of the attendance data. Releasing the data right before Christmas when schools had finished for the year would have been cynical. Therefore, the Ministry released the data at the start of the year to help raise awareness of the issue so that parents, students and schools are reminded that we need to continue to have a razor-sharp focus on turning the attendance rates around in 2023.
Why is she continuing to say that the release of the Term 3 data is not up to her but the Ministry of Education, when comments from a senior analyst from the Ministry of Education in an email to my office state that the release of the data depends on the Minister's approval?
Mr Speaker, I can categorically tell that member that the Ministry of Education is responsible for the data. I have no say over that. But
Mr. Speaker. The Ministry aims to get the data out as quickly as possible, but it is important that the data is both accurate and the contextual information is provided. I'm advised that sometimes this process can be delayed for publication. For example, Mr. Speaker, last year, Term 3 data for 2021 was released in April 2022. So if we were to follow the member's logic, we are actually early with the Term 3 data this year. Mr. Speaker, I also remind the member that there is no requirement to release the data.
Order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Erica Stanford.
I seek leave to table an email received by my office from a Ministry of Education official stating the final attendance data depends on the Minister's approval.
Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there any objection? There appears to be none. May be tabled.
Supplementary. Thank you. Who is the public supposed to believe? The Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Education, who on the 7th of December at Select Committee said that the data was expected any day now and would be released before Christmas, or the Minister of Education, who has claimed in recent media interviews that another 8 weeks of analysis was required, which happened to perfectly coincide with her policy announcement yesterday.
Mr. Speaker, arguing about when the data is released is a waste of time. The government is focused on solutions. We have solutions about putting children and young people at the centre of the response to the attendance issues. If the member wants to continue carrying on arguing about when the data is released, carry on, but that won't make the difference. Our policies will.
Can the Minister categorically state here in the House today that she played no part in the delay of the release of the information when it was made available to her on the 20th of December?
Mr. Speaker, I already have. It is a decision for the Ministry of Education.
We'll see. Supplementary. Can she explain how releasing the attendance data before Christmas would have been cynical, as she has stated in the media yesterday and again today, but sitting on the data for another 2 months and releasing it the same day as her policy announcement is not cynical?
Mr. Speaker, absolutely, yes I can. I know that the member has not worked in schools, but schools have finished by the 20th of December. Who will make the big difference to attendance? It's our whānau and it's our schools. Putting it out when they can have the focus on it and not be concerned about the fact when they've had a really tough year around what they're doing the following year, that won't make the difference. I know this from experience. Please listen.
Listen to experience. Question number 11, Arena Williams.
E te māngai o te whare. My question is to the Minister of Small Business. How is the government supporting small businesses affected by recent extreme weather events?
The Honourable Ginny Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, firstly, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give my condolences to those people in New Zealand who lost loved ones in the recent extreme weather events that New Zealand has gone through. It's just 2 months into the year and small businesses have faced unprecedented challenges. The government has moved quickly to support those small businesses in 2 different ways. Auckland small businesses have been provided with a resilience package of $5 million, and just this week we have announced an additional $50 million package in the wake of Cyclone Gabrielle to deliver interim emergency business support to both small businesses and the primary sector.
How will these emergency packages support small businesses?
Mr. Speaker, it is my priority as the Minister for Small Businesses that those areas get the support that they need. They are the hardest hit during this time, and it's important that we provide that support. The Auckland package provides not only mental health support, but also business continuity to those businesses that need it. The $50 million Cyclone Gabrielle package announced this week will assist businesses and workers by providing a wide range of supports. Mr. Speaker, we are working closely on the ground with local business associations, iwi and local government to ensure this package is focused where the greatest need lies.
When will small businesses start to receive this support?
Mr. Speaker, as quickly as possible. Already we have small businesses who have received funding in Auckland. Funding as part of the Auckland package has been released, and we are working on the ground up to make sure we tailor the response to those and how they need it.
What feedback has she had from small businesses who have been affected by these extreme weather events?
Mr. Speaker, I visited small businesses who have been directly impacted by the floods in Auckland. Since then, I've been in regular contact with chambers of commerce right across those regions that have been impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle. The message they gave me, loud and clear in person, is they want a government that will walk alongside of them to recover, rebuild and be resilient. That's exactly what we will continue to provide throughout this recovery.
Question number 12, Simeon Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Transport. Does he still expect, quote, early works to commence in 2023, end quote, on Auckland Light Rail? If so, on what date in 2023 will early works commence?
The Honourable Michael Ward.
Mr. Speaker, yes, tomorrow.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementaries are heard in silence.
On what date will the first metre of light rail track be completed?
Mr. Speaker, what we'll be doing this year is moving into the commencement of early works, followed later this year by the confirmation of station location and moving forward with the consenting process. We expect main works on the Auckland Light Rail project to begin in approximately 2025.
Does the Minister think that spending $30 billion on the light rail project in Auckland is a better use of money than fixing the broken roads and bridges in the Hawke's Bay which have been destroyed by Cyclone Gabrielle?
Mr. Speaker, the member is in the first instance wrong in the figures that he uses in his question. Secondly, if the member believes that any Minister of Transport or Government should only proceed with one project or priority in the transport portfolio at time, then that would explain the mess that this government inherited from an underinvestment in transport in the 9 years that lot were in control of the portfolio. For the record, our government this week has invested $250 million to support the people of cyclone-ravaged regions by providing that commitment to rebuilding their devastated roading network. For the record, it is this government which has increased investment in the maintenance of our state highway network by 50% after the National Party froze it for 8 years. For the record, it is this government which is investing $8.7 billion through the New Zealand Upgrade Programme to deliver critical projects across regional New Zealand. And for the record, it is this government which has invested $8 billion to rebuild a broken rail network that party neglected for its 9 years in government. We are the party that invests in transport infrastructure now, but also for the future.
Is it true that Auckland Light Rail only survived the government's policy review as a concession to him pulling out of the Labour Party leadership race?
Mr. Speaker, no. Auckland Light Rail is an important project because this is a government that actually believes in and invests in Auckland and is aware of the growth that it will experience over the next 30 years. It is an important project because it is part of an integrated plan to finally deliver the people of Auckland a linked-up public transport of the kind that they have not had for decades and decades. That's why we are not only investing in Auckland Light Rail, but why in the coming months we'll be opening the next stages of the Northern Corridor on the North Shore. It's why we've built the first stage of the Eastern Busway into Pakuranga and will shortly be putting shovels in the ground for the second stage through to the Botany electorate. It's why we're underway with the electrification of rail to Pukekohe. It's why that we're protecting the corridor for mass rapid transit between airport and Botany. And it's why by the middle of this year we'll have a plan to take forward the alternative Waitemata Harbour crossing. On this side of the House, we believe in Auckland and we'll actually make the investments that we need for our Queen City.
And that concludes oral questions. I call on Government Order of the Day.
adjourn debate on the Prime Minister's statement and the amendment proposed to it.
The Honourable Carmel Sepuloni.
Mr Speaker, just want to start by saying that we have a lot as a country to be proud of, and what we've come to realise over the course of the last 3.5 weeks is that one of those things is that in the midst of hard times, New Zealanders do come together and do recognise there is strength and solidarity. Mr Speaker, on the 27th of January, as many Aucklanders were just settling in to what was meant to be the long anniversary weekend, the weather system hit suddenly. As a result of this night, 4 people lost their lives. Many more would be homeless, and thousands would be wondering if their house would remain habitable. My aroha, Mr Speaker, goes out to all of these people and their families. That night I saw firsthand the true spirit of our nation as we banded together to help one another. First responders went above and beyond to make sure people were able to get to safe places. And in my own electorate of Kelston, the spirit of a community came together to make sure our people had a safe, warm and above all dry place to spend the night. What we saw were individuals and families walking through the doors of that hall at St Leonard's School in Kelston, having experienced trauma and also coming with a number of complex challenges. I met many of those families and many of them shared with me their stories and their experiences. And it is incredibly humbling when you are sitting there in the middle of the night listening to these traumatic stories firsthand, and people are sharing with you the horrible circumstances that they have had to endure. I'll never forget the family that came through who spoke of the woman having been trapped inside her house. The water had risen to such an extent that the front door would not open and she could not get out. The back door, when she opened it, there'd been a slip, so she could not get out the back and she could not escape through a window. She was fortunate she was able to get her hands on a cell phone to ring 111 and was rescued by the emergency services. I spoke to one woman who carried her child up the street with water up to her neck and had to rely on a neighbour to take over, given the height of the water and the difficulty she was having carrying her child. Mr Speaker, not only did they experience trauma, but they came in with a number of complex challenges. It became apparent very quickly that a number of people had lost their medication in the floods. One woman with breast cancer, a number of people with high blood pressure and heart conditions, one man who only had 30% vision and had lost his eye drops and needed them urgently to be able to retain the vision that he did have. A tetraplegic man came in on that night because he was flooded out of his house. These are the very real and traumatic experiences that New Zealanders endured not only in Auckland, Madam Speaker. Within a week, we had another weather event. The cyclones have meant that Auckland, Northland, the Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, the East Coast, the Wairarapa, the Hawke's Bay have all been tragically affected by what ensued from the weather events, Madam Speaker. But again, just like I saw in Kelston, we have seen communities band together and come together to support the people that were affected. Sadly, 11 more New Zealanders have been known to have lost their lives, with more missing or still unaccounted for. Our hearts from all of this House, I know that this is true, go out to their families and communities who are grieving right now. These extreme weather events have taught us many lessons which we will apply in the rebuild and recover, but they have also shown us the very best of us. They have shown that we as a nation have each other's backs when the chips are down. Yesterday, the Prime Minister laid out for this House the government's intentions for supporting New Zealand families and businesses through these difficult times. I want to echo what the Prime Minister said yesterday. Our government's #1 priority is to support New Zealand families and businesses through difficult economic conditions and the impact of cyclone and floods. We are committed to building back better, building back safer and building back smarter. The Prime Minister and Minister Robertson will have more details on the cyclone and flood recovery in the coming weeks. Madam Speaker, there's been a number of things that I've been reflecting on over the course of the last few weeks, but one of them is the importance of our welfare system. And I have said on a number of occasions over the course of the last 5 years that our welfare system is there for every New Zealander. Quite often, there is a stigma attached to the welfare system and assertions that there are only a certain group or certain groups of New Zealanders that need to access the support. This weather event showed us why it's important to recognise that the welfare system is there for everyone. We've had $36 million go out already in civil defence payments. Over 72,000 people have accessed those civil defence payments. We've had MSD staff at almost all evacuation centres where possible across the country, not working by themselves, Madam Speaker, but working alongside the very important community groups and iwi organisations and first responders to form that collaborative effort that needs to be there to support these whānau during difficult times. It also made me reflect on where we started with the welfare system, which was changing the culture to ensure that all New Zealanders had their dignity upheld by the welfare system. And I think at this point in time, and I would hope, every person in this House should agree that when New Zealanders are experiencing traumatic experiences, in this particular example, it is weather events and having to evacuate their homes in many instances, then they deserve to be able to turn to a welfare system that upholds their dignity and works for them, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I do want to recognise the community, iwi and organisations and NGOs that have been working. Many of them got in there early. They used the resource that they had. Fortunately, a number were set up because they'd been resourced through caring in communities, but they were able to use that resource to immediately respond to the needs of whānau. In those early days, when I spoke to social services and community organisations, they were very clear with me that they would have enough for that time, but it would be important that we turned our eye to what they would need in the coming weeks, and we've certainly done that. We announced last week the $11.5 million package that would be there to support them in some instances to help replenish the stocks that they have exhausted because of the support they've been providing people impacted by the weather events, and in many instances to support them for what will come, because the recovery will not be instant. There will be many families who will continue to experience challenges because of what has occurred. Madam Speaker, I also want to point out the importance of workforce at this time. We have spent the last 5 years investing in areas where we've had workforce shortages, particularly in areas like trades and apprenticeships. We are going to need them more than ever over the coming months as we recover and rebuild. And I want to acknowledge that that investment was to address the workforce shortages we were already experiencing, but I also want to acknowledge that we can't take our foot off the accelerator now, and this government's focus and prioritisation on building the workforce that we need for New Zealand continues to be a priority and will be more important than ever given the horrific impacts that we have seen on people's homes across the country. Madam Speaker, I want to end by making sure that I fully thank and acknowledge all of the people that have been out there helping those families that have been impacted. In my own electorate, we have had former All Blacks, we have had community groups, we have iwi on the ground. We've got many volunteers that aren't necessarily getting paid to provide support to these whānau. Many of them impacted in some way too by the floods or the cyclone. And I know that that effort is being replicated across the country, Madam Speaker. And so I want to acknowledge each and every one of those people that are undertaking that work. I want to encourage them because the work will continue for some time, And Madam Speaker, we need to continue to work in solidarity if we are going to address the needs of the whānau and communities that have been impacted by these weather events. Māloa pito.
I call on Nicola Willis.
These are dark and foreboding times for New Zealand. Never before have I witnessed and stood amongst as much destruction and devastation as I saw in Hawke's Bay and Gisborne last week. And it is apparent, I think, to all members of this House that in this dark hour we must back New Zealanders in a great time of need, and we have a great responsibility as leaders to deliver for them. As I stand here, Cyclone Gabrielle has wreaked its havoc. I extend our utmost thoughts to those who've experienced the loss of family members, the death toll of 11 people, to all of your friends and family. I think of the more than 1,000 people who are still uncontactable and the great anguish and anxiety their friends and family must be experiencing. My thoughts are with all of those people and families and communities who have had their lives turned upside down, their houses destroyed, their farms destroyed, their jobs gone, their possessions gone. To everyone in Napier, the Coromandel, Hastings, Tolaga Bay, Gisborne, Auckland, all of you who are anxious, who are exhausted, who are frustrated, and in too many cases, Madam Speaker, who are feeling hopeless. And I think our job in this House is to give these New Zealanders hope. National will continue to support the efforts needed to respond to this great disaster. We continue to stand behind all of those working on the response. We continue to back the need for a rebuild, and we know that that is both immediate and medium term. But we also see that hope will be about more than the words that are offered. Hope will be about delivery. So how is it that we will contribute to that? The first thing I want to do is to shine a spotlight on the heroes in our community who rose to this time of need, because I see hope in them. And one of them is a man called Cameron Taylor. And I had the great privilege of spending some time with him on Friday, and he told me of his rapid evacuation from his home in Hawke's Bay as he saw the rivers rising. As he drove out of the floodwaters into safety, his immediate thought was for those families living near him who may not have been so lucky to escape. And so, putting health and safety rules to the side, Cameron talked to a pilot, he got himself up in a chopper, and he went and rescued families from their roofs. He had no thought for himself. He was selfless, he was brave, he was courageous. And even when he thought he had rescued all the people and he saw a hole in a roof with a metal bar and a white cloth extending out of it, he said, let's hover the chopper there, and he pulled with his bare hands an elderly couple from their ceiling cavity where they were floating in water. These are acts of heroism. And as Cameron shared this trauma with me, he was very slow to then talk about the fact that his business, which employs 300 people, has suffered immense destruction. Orchards gone, packing house filled with mud, cool store broken. So as we work together over these next few weeks and months to rebuild those areas ravaged by disaster, I'm going to think of Cameron and how we need to be accountable to him. And I am worried, Madam Speaker, about whether or not this government has the track record to properly deliver in these circumstances. because we do have a backdrop here of a Labour government who have failed to deliver infrastructure. Starting with the promise of 100,000 Kiwi-built homes, never built. The light rail promise that was meant to be at Auckland Airport by 2021, not 1 metre laid. But more recently, I think of the promise from Chris Hipkins and Grant Robertson following COVID that they would build back better, that they would immediately fund shovel-ready infrastructure projects. And the words were there, and they started 225 of these projects. They're great at starting things, but they haven't finished them, Madam Speaker. Only 49 have been completed. And so I stand with those New Zealanders who in this hour of need say, Nicola, I am worried that they're going to fudge it, that they're going to forget about us, that they're not going to get it done. And it's all very well and good for ministers opposite to say this time it will be different. But New Zealanders know that the road here was paved with Labour's good intentions. And good intentions won't get the bridges built. Good intentions won't pay the supermarket bills of workers who lose their jobs. Good intentions won't deliver the housing that this government has already had 5 years to deliver and hasn't been able to do. So we will stand proudly in this House to hold the government accountable, and we will propose smarter ways for delivering the recovery that New Zealand so badly needs. But my thought when I think of what hope is needed in the country now extends beyond the rebuild. We must not forget that whether New Zealanders have been touched by the cyclone and the floods or not, they are in the midst of a cost of living crisis. And that cost of living crisis has gone on and on for month upon month. We have now today had the 10th increase in the official cash rate. We've never had the cash rate rise this fast before. The only time it's risen in this many times is under the last Labour government. And even then, it was 5. And the very real reality that mortgage holders across the country are looking at is flicking from a mortgage with a 2 or 3 in front of it to a mortgage with a 6 or 7% rate. That is hundreds of dollars per fortnight. And this at the same time as the Reserve Bank tells us that inflation, that thief in everyone's pocket, is here to stay for some time longer. Even while the US inflation rate dips well below us, even while Canada starts to say goodbye, it's here to stay in New Zealand. And I find it unfathomable, absolutely unfathomable, that at this time of crisis, when New Zealanders are seeking hope and confidence and certainty, the Finance Minister and his Prime Minister think it appropriate to dangle over New Zealanders' heads the prospect of yet another tax. This is a sword of Damocles that should not be there at this time, because actually the job that those two men need to do right now is give people confidence that there are better times ahead. And you don't do that by saying, actually, we see this as a great opportunity to pad down your pockets for some more cash for our pet projects. And how can it be okay that at a time when there are New Zealanders who don't even know whether they're going to have a job next week, who worry about whether or not they're going to be able to keep their home, that the ministers opposite think it's a great time to double down on their pet political project of light rail? Those workers, those engineers, those diggers need to be helping out on our rural roads and getting lifelines and infrastructure connections going again, and a good government would see that. So National stands here knowing that many people are relying on Parliament to deliver for them. Well, we back them. We stand with New Zealanders not just with words, but with delivery. That is our track record, because we know that only with delivery will New Zealanders have the strong foundation to bounce back from this worst of times. We will hold the government to account. This one's for you, Cameron.
I call on Honourable Penny Henare.
Tēnā koe te māngai o te whare. A ka noho a hau ki roto i te reo Māori mo te wahanga poto. He karanga waitua, he tai timu, he tai pari. He tai ka tai atu ki hea, ka tai atu ki a nunumi mā, ki a roroa mā, ki te hunga kua oti atu ki te pō. Kia tāpai ake ki runga i waku kupu mihi ki te tāhuhu kōrero o tō tātou whare, te hunga mate, ki roto i ngā wiki tata kua pahure ake nei. A kua kōrero hia nei e te whare mo te āhuatanga ki ngā tāngata i riro ki roto i te horo nuku o Muriwai. Anā kua kōrero hia te whare mo te āhuatanga ki ngā tāngata i riro atu ki roto i te Waipuke, ki roto i te matau a Māui, ki roto anō hoki i te tai rāwhiti. Nā ka tāpai ake ki ngā mate huhua o Aua Taima, nā te ingoa o tōku matua a Vince Heperi i riro ki roto i te pōwhiri nui a te matatini i na nahi rā ki roto o Tāmaki Makaurau. Nō reira, ko te āhuatanga o te ao Māori kia mihi hia, kia tangi hia o tātou mate i te tuatahi, ka mutu ka huri tuatu ki ngā kaupapa o te ao kiko kiko, nō reira āpiti hono tātai hono rātou ki a rātou, āpiti hono tātai hono tātou te hunga ora tēnā koutou. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for allowing me the opportunity, as is customary on marae across the country, to farewell the departed first. Of course, I acknowledge those who were sadly lost in the weather events that have plagued this country over the past few weeks. I also add to that my condolences to the family of Vince Heperi, who sadly passed away at the Te Matatini Pōwhiri yesterday in Tāmaki Makaurau. All of those who have passed, we share in this House the one sentiment of condolences and love to their families. It is too in that tone, Madam Speaker, that we look towards those who have responded in these weather events that have plagued our country over the past few weeks, but indeed in the years gone by. Today in question time, Madam Speaker, my colleague, the Honourable Kieran McAnulty, made clear that only 3 times in our history have we declared a national state of emergency. One under his watch as Minister for the National Emergency and Management Agency, and I can say one of the other times was when I was the Minister for Civil Defence as we responded to COVID-19. The track record of this government in responding to crises that affect this country is quite clear. We've managed to navigate the tricky waters of COVID-19, the same waters that the international community had to wade through and navigate through, and I can say that the track record from this government is one of success. We've come through that particular period well off and better off than many of our counterparts that we compare ourselves to around the world. Then when we look to these weather events, I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that the true is said, that on this side of the House, and the same is true, that on this side of the House, this government looks towards responding to those important matters that arise from the crises that our country is currently facing. And I can tell you, Madam Speaker, not just in Tāmaki Makaurau through the floods, but also as Cyclone Gabrielle bore down on this country, I'm proud to say that those first responders in FENZ, in the New Zealand Defence Force, and in our communities spurred into action and responded appropriately. And I want to acknowledge for my part as Minister for Whānau Ora, the Whānau Ora providers and the Whānau Ora commissioning agencies across this country. They dipped into their own pockets to allow an instant response for families in affected areas. They also pivoted their resources away from what would be considered business as usual because of the exceptional circumstances our communities found themselves in, pivoting workforce, pivoting resources to make sure that the communities had what they need. The same is said about the Māori health providers in this country, Madam Speaker. They've already dipped into cash reserves of their own to make sure not only were they able to respond to the weather events, but also continue to keep our communities safe from COVID-19. When we find ourselves in an evacuation centre, and I was fortunate to visit a number of those evacuation centres during the Auckland floods, those health providers were at the door, continually reminding ourselves that COVID is still in our community. And when you come into contact during emergency situations with people who are unknown to you and your community, it is important that we must remind ourselves that COVID-19 is still in our community. But I want to acknowledge them, those providers, health and whānau water providers, because they did an exceptional job. In order for us to support them, what we've been able to do, Madam Speaker, is relieve some of the contractual obligations that we might ordinarily see under business as usual. And that's important because it's too much to expect them to do business as usual while responding to these exceptional circumstances due to the weather event. So I'm really proud of the way we've been able to support them, and I want to reiterate to those providers and those communities that this government is here, this government is listening, and this government will stand by them during the recovery. We've just heard from the other side of the House that this government has been light on delivery. Well, Madam Speaker, I can say that side of the House promised bridges once upon a time, in fact, in my time in this House, and delivered nothing. Madam Speaker, I can also say that side of the House has also promised the kinds of investments in infrastructure that our communities have been calling for, but from them we've seen nothing. From this side of the House, despite the exceptional circumstances of the weather events, despite the exceptional circumstances of COVID-19, one, we've responded to them, and two, we continue to do the mahi to make sure that the infrastructure that this country so richly deserves is having investment made into it and is making sure that we can continue to progress, because it's that kind of investment that will make sure that our country not only will navigate these challenging times, but also come out with great prosperity, Madam Speaker. Part of that too is, of course, making sure that for those who are affected most by these weather events, we are able to respond, but also support them to recover. Madam Speaker, we've already made a number of announcements to look towards investing in our infrastructure that has been broken because of these weather events. We've also made a number of investments into those who have helped respond. Madam Speaker, we've made a commitment to those responders that we will be there to continue to listen to them, to make sure that our response is agile enough to meet their needs. And what's really important, Madam Speaker, is not only should it have national coordination, which is what this government is promising, but also that the regional voice is being heard during the recovery. We've said it many times in this House. What happens in Te Tai Rāwhiti is different to what happens in Te Tai Tokerau. The response required in Te Mata Wā Māui is different to the response that will be required in Tāmaki Makaurau. Therefore, it's important that we continue to take a strong regional approach, which is what the Prime Minister has announced in supporting the recovery from the weather events. I wholeheartedly support that approach, and I'm sure many of the members in this House, as they reflect on their constituencies and their electorates, that local voice is really important. And I'm proud, Madam Speaker, that our Prime Minister has decided to make the call to coordinate and to support centrally, but more importantly, to drive those outcomes and those desired outcomes for the recovery locally, because that's going to be important. Madam Speaker, there are a number of other things that I just want to briefly touch on. One is, of course, we know that the bread and butter issues that continue to face our families are still there despite the weather events. So we've got to make sure that we're working on both of those things. And of course, this government has already announced the increase to the minimum wage, which is really important. That puts money in the pockets of the lowest paid people in our country. And that makes sure that many of them who are Māori, Pacific, and other ethnic communities who find themselves in the lower paid ranks of this country continues to put more support behind them, continues to back the work that they do by paying them appropriately. Madam Speaker, it isn't all bad news. I want to finish my contribution by saying today starts the Te Matatini Festival. They call it the Olympics of Kapahaka. It is the biggest Māori event on the calendar, not just in this country, but in the world. And as thousands around the world, and indeed locally, will tune in to watch their family their loved ones, despite the challenges that we've faced over the past few years, come together in spirit, come together in performance on stage to share with the rest of the world our culture, the Māori culture, the Indigenous culture of this land. I welcome one and all to Tāmaki Makaurau and to my electorate to partake in what is truly a festival of love, a festival of culture, and a festival of hope. Nō reira, e te māngai o te whare, haere mai ki au ki runga o Tāmaki, kia ora tātou katoa.
Kia ora.
Madam
The
Speaker.
next call is a split call. I call on Ricardo Menendez-March for 5 minutes.
Tēnā koe, Madam Speaker. Like many in this House, I'd like to begin my contribution by acknowledging the lives lost, the families and communities that have been displaced by climate change-induced extreme weather events that we have seen recently. It has been deeply distressing to see the extent of the damage and the challenge ahead of us. But what we have seen as well on the ground has been the communities that have rallied together to support one another, groups that have organically now been created as a result of the devastation and have tried to put whatever little resources they each have to support their neighbors and their communities. In my own neighborhood, I've seen the Student Volunteer Army deploying people to help with the cleanup. I have seen marae and schools responding rapidly to the needs of our communities. I've also seen firsthand the families that have been affected. Like many others here in Parliament, we visited our neighbours and the people in our roads. I've seen migrant families that have struggled to access the support that they require and have required assistance to communicate in English. The accessibility needs of our disabled communities who are often left in inaccessible shelter. But it is not enough as MPs for just to visit these communities on the grounds without acknowledging that what we are seeing are the inequalities that are laid bare as a result of this disaster. Inequalities that in fact have been here for decades. And so we need to set the bar higher than simply accepting that poverty exists or that the research tells us that climate change is very much human-induced. We need to confront these realities with action and to echo the Prime Minister's words, business as usual won't work anymore. But this cannot just be a slogan. It needs to be matched with the action that researchers and communities have been calling for, because climate change won't be impacting everyone equally. In fact, the communities who often contribute the least to climate change are some who are going to be the most impacted as a result of these weather events. The communities who struggle to make ends meet on a good sunny day will be struggling even more on the face of extreme weather events. The people who have been receiving income support, who have been facing insecure housing, these are some of the communities who are paying the highest price despite contributing the least to these weather events. And this is why the response and the recovery needs to take a climate justice lens. It needs to include guaranteeing a livable income for all so that we build resilience in our communities. It needs to guarantee quality public housing so that people have a secure home to live in despite the weather events. It needs to ensure that our income support system treats people with dignity. And I want to acknowledge the Deputy Prime Minister's words around having a welfare system that treats people with dignity. And that's all well and done to have a smiling face at the door of work and income. But when benefit levels continue being below the poverty line, that is not treating people like dignity. Until we lift people above the poverty line and ensure that they're guaranteed a life with dignity, we are not treating people with the respect that they deserve. I want to acknowledge the many migrant workers as well who have been impacted by these weather events, including our RSC workers in the regions, many who have faced precarious and exploitative conditions. If we're going to take a climate justice lens to a recovery, it also means ensuring that the conditions of these workers improve. This is no time for lengthy reviews, this is time for action. The changes that needs to happen to the RSC scheme and the improvements we need to make for migrant workers in general who will be contributing to our recovery need to come now. Part of business as usual not continuing the same needs to require tackling and holding to account those that are responsible for climate change, the corporations that are ripping off our communities, who are polluting our environment, taxing the wealthy few so that we can provide livable incomes and good public services for all, is critical as part of this recovery. The Greens are committed to fighting for these things to guarantee a livable planet for all. Kia ora.
I call on Goris Garriman, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will begin, as we all have in this House, by acknowledging those lives lost as a result of the extreme weather events of recent weeks, but also those who have lost so much, who are in the midst of that loss right now. I know that the anxiety we experienced in Tāmaki Makaurau was as a result of the extreme experience of the floods, where we were caught off guard. Well, many of us certainly were, and the impact was felt so deeply as part of that shock, and then to wait at home with our go bags for the cyclone to come, and that anxiety, that climate anxiety, as we have an entire generation call it now, is part of sort of the DNA of our nation right now, and it will be going forward. So I just want to acknowledge that, and that there are victims still living with that uncertainty now. But I do want to also acknowledge that this is actually part of a global stress. We are experiencing an existential crisis, much like the COVID pandemic, but one that the island nations around us, as we sit in the Pacific community, have been telling us about for years. We know that there are small island atolls that have already been evacuated over the past decade as a whole community to bigger islands. We know, and we learnt this as part of a visit just last year by our Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, that even in Fiji, one of the largest of the Pacific Islands and the most stable of economies, that multiple islands, dozens, villages have been moved already as a result of rising seas. So the evacuations, the loss of home, the loss of lives, the uncertainty that we have experienced at an extreme level this month has been experienced by our Pacific Island community for years, and they have been raising the alarm bells for years and years in global forums. New Zealand wasn't much of a leader in terms of global policy when it came to health equity with COVID, although we had a great response here for us. My hope as a Green is that we recognise the global character of climate crisis, and the idea of climate justice requires us to be a bold voice for climate mitigation right now, we finally learnt, but also that prevention stuff, that we stand with our Asia-Pacific neighbours, that we recognise that the floods in Pakistan that were incredible in the images that we saw and the devastation are a reflection of what we're experiencing right now. That the lack of resiliency in Syria and Turkey, who are experiencing extreme devastation as a result of earthquakes right now, is a reflection of what could happen here if we don't build back resiliently, but that we need to do that as a global community, that none of us are in fact going to be okay if some of us are struggling, that equality is part of the climate response, and that the time to be bold for both global equality and climate action is now. I met a couple of years ago, before the COVID crisis, when travel was possible, the UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, and he'd given himself, as part of his mandate to look into extreme poverty, the mandate to look at climate change and the impact on poverty. He had found such extreme risk for a rise in poverty and the devastation of climate change as an impact on both raising levels of poverty in the global sphere and also impacting those already in poverty, that he called it a risk of climate apartheid. So our response needs to be fulsome, it needs to be bold, and it needs to reflect our experience as a Pacifica nation. one that knows the impacts of climate change right now and has been warned about it for many years to come, before now.
The next call is a split call. I call on the Minister, the Honourable Jenny Anderson.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's a privilege to stand and take a call in the Prime Minister's statement today and the following debate. First of all, Madam Speaker, I wish to acknowledge the strain right now on small businesses in New Zealand. Not only do we have a small business community that has had to go through the turbulent times of COVID, with particular reference to those small businesses in Auckland, but since then we have had the Auckland floods, and since then we have had Cyclone Gabrielle. There is not a time in my lifetime I can remember where the business community has had to grapple with such unprecedented challenges. And those I have met on the ground, that is exactly the words I hear back from those small business owners, that not only are they faced with the difficulties sometimes of navigating the local government processes of having a building or a property stickered and going through that process, but in addition to that, there's also the insurance process, whether they are to get an assessor to also be able to try and get business continuity insurance in place. And then begin the massive task ahead of repairing and rebuilding. But what struck me the most is that out of all of those concerns, out of all of that paperwork and thinking that they carried on their shoulders each night as they went home, that the primary concern was that for their workers and their families, because they wanted to continue to provide wages so that those people who relied upon them as the business owner could continue to take home a wage each week. And that was what really struck me the most. And I see that in the resilience, the innovation and the amazing tenacity that our small business community has. And I know it is that tenacity that will stand in incredibly good strength as we continue to rebuild and do that in a way that we're more resilient to future weather events such as the ones that we've been through recently. The government support package has been tailored to respond to the specific needs in each of those areas. In relation to Auckland, it's been great to see that in the past few days we've already had the first payments going out to small businesses. To have that being transferred in such a short period of time is good to see, because I know it is needed. And in terms of Auckland, not only have we got the business continuity support, but in that package is specific provision for mental health support. And that comes in the form of a program that already existed called the First Steps program, which provided expert support and resources to business owners and leaders who were feeling overwhelmed and isolated and under pressure from the recent weather events. And so my message today is for anyone who knows someone who is under that strain, is that help is there, support is there. And whether that's an online resource or whether you need to take steps further and have some one-on-one time with someone who can provide you with a plan and a framework to move forward, that's so important. Because the number one rule I always think of in terms of mental health is you've got to get yourself okay before you can help others. And that is so critical at times like this when pressure is building up. So in terms of the Cyclone Gabrielle package, came pretty quick off the heels in terms of the Auckland flood response, that we've made 50 million available, not only to small business but also to the wider primary sector. And I'd like to stress how important it is that we do a ground-up approach, because we still do not know, Madam Speaker, the exact extent of the damage, and we know that some businesses are impacted far more than others. And so it's important that we work with local community groups, business networks, iwi, local council, chambers of commerce. All of those on-the-ground networks will be essential for us to understand what is the best way to provide ongoing support and work work alongside of the business community to build back resilience, to build back stronger telecommunications, to build back stronger road networks, and to make sure that our communities are set up for the future as we go through more of these climate change related events. Madam Speaker, I would like to finish up by saying how much I admire and respect those on the ground who have mucked in, rolled up their sleeves, dug up silt and helped out people. The one thing that's come through is it's kept people smiling to know their neighbours are looking out for them, and it fills my heart to see that Kiwi spirit shine through. Thank you.
I call on Shannon Halbert.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I stand to acknowledge the Prime Minister's statement, presented at an incredibly difficult time on the heels of one of the most significant weather events in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that we have seen this century. And my heart goes out to our people in Auckland, our communities on the East Coast, and to friends and whānau in the Hawke's Bay who have faced devastation in such sad times. As I listened to the Prime Minister's statement, I was heartened by his outlook, the combination of our government's aspiration, optimism and resilience for New Zealand and for those of us in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland. Because we have to be optimistic at times like this. And our Prime Minister is standing by New Zealanders, looking them squarely in the eyes and telling them that they are not alone. And we are committed to rebuilding the regions, to Auckland, the groups and communities that felt the brunt of the cyclone and recent floods. Madam Speaker, there has been a $50 million support package recently announced, of which half of this, $25 million, is for the primary sector recovery from Cyclone Gabrielle. This is for our farmers, growers, whenua Māori owners and rural communities who have also been affected. And of course, this government has been dealing with many tough issues before this particular cyclone. We are working to tackle the country's infrastructure needs, and as Chair of the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee, I can attest to this. And as an Aucklander, I know the importance of improving our roads, the needs for an improved digital connectivity system, better public transport, and the pipes for new homes and growth. We know the difference that good infrastructure makes. The government's investment in water infrastructure in Northcote was life-saving in the recent floods that preceded the cyclone, compared to the devastating impacts of the Waido Valley just next door. We know the urgency to get on with an additional connection across the Waitemata Harbour, given our uncertain reliance on the existing harbour bridge. A third harbour crossing is an absolute must. And we know the value of quality housing developments, like the Northcote development, in addressing the housing shortfall that we inherited. And we know the difference our property investment program has made to our local schools. Every school and every child has benefited. Madam Speaker, attending school in kura regularly is crucial to student progress and achievement. And I'm a very, very strong believer in quality education, having worked in this particular space. And might I say, I'm very passionate about it too. Education changes lives. However, we've got to work on our attendance challenges that confront us at the moment with the declining attendance statistics since 2015. The recent work on our attendance and engagement strategy must see education improvements with the increased resources announced by our Minister recently. This will bring back localised services to my community. It's something that has been asked of me since well before I became a Member of Parliament, and the outcome is too great to ignore, that thousands of young people will benefit and thrive as a result. And I want that for other communities too. And there is no doubt that families and businesses are going through difficult economic conditions too. This government, the Hipkins government, is responding to the cost of living pressures families are facing, particularly in Auckland. And our focus is very much on targeting the support of working families in order to take the pressure off. The extensions of the fuel excise reductions, road user charges, and public transport will reduce the cost of filling up the 60-litre tank of petrol by around $17.25, and half-price public transport will save an average person who pays two $5 fares $25 a week. Madam Speaker, more than 56,000 small businesses are learning the skills that they need to improve productivity through digitising their business through the Digital Boost. It's initiatives like this where we build back better in current times like we're seeing in our communities. But most of all, we do it side by side, shoulder to shoulder with our communities and with our people.
Speaker.
The next call is a split call. I call on Brooke Van Velden.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it is a pleasure to be back in Parliament for the year. And what a year it's been already. You know, my thoughts are with everybody who's been affected by the heavy rain, the cyclone and the floods, and we hope that that's the end of it. But our ACT MPs have been out in the community over these past few weeks, listening to New Zealanders to see how we can support them and also hear what's on their minds so that we can represent them here in this House. And what I've seen in the community is the worst of nature, but the best of Kiwi spirit. Just on Monday, I was in Hawke's Bay and I spent some time in Havelock North. And on Joel Street, which had been heavily affected, I met volunteers from the neighbouring streets who were cooking warm meals, who were providing water and shelter to people, other volunteers who had come to help clear the silt and clear away all of the destroyed property. They had 200 volunteers from the local community come out, pick up their own shovels and put on their own gloves to help out the community. There have been neighbours who have been rescuing each other. And in Auckland, in the following days of the floods, I was out there helping the Waitakere Indian Association deliver warm meals to people who had no kitchens, no electronics that were working. And I saw a woman who was in her 90s who had given up her own bed to somebody else who had no home to go to. I heard from people whose own insurance brokers had turned up to take the walls, the destroyed walls off their homes. And this is a community that's getting together to help each other. There's a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety, but it's not where it ends. People have stress and anxiety because of the cyclone and the flood and the heavy rains, but because of everyday life as well. You know, in the community, I've been hearing from concerned women who feel like crime has increased so far they no longer feel it's safe to walk to work in our CBDs. They don't feel like it's safe when they leave their work facility to walk home or even walk to public transport, but instead they're Ubering home, and that's not good enough. We're hearing from families who feel like the cost of living is rising so much that to get food on the table, they have to forego saving anything that week. We're hearing from cafe staff. I was just talking to a cafe owner last week who said it's so hard to find staff that he hasn't had a break all Christmas. He worked the entire way through. We've heard from families with small children that mortgage rate rises are getting them very, very stressed. Their repayments will be doubling this year from what they were paying last year. I've heard from people with small children who are worried that they can't even get in to see a doctor. I was in Carterton just last week. They don't have a GP. They need to go to the local hospital in Masterton. But of course, I talked to people then in Masterton who said they're worried they can't even get into the hospitals at all. There is so much stress and anxiety, and it just feels like everything is so hard. And we've heard from people who find it's impossible to get any workers in through the borders. Builders saying that bureaucracy is increasing and increasing and increasing. That's right. And for a young Kiwi, it just feels like the path to home ownership is getting harder and harder. Where is that path to home ownership? Where is the path to having a job that keeps up with inflationary costs. And where is that path to a future in New Zealand? Well, ACT says what's happening at the moment isn't fair. It is hard, but we can't have more of the same. We need the government to cut wasteful spending. We need to simplify immigration. We need to show leadership on crime. We need to simplify our building laws. And we want people to once again feel like they can make a difference in their own lives. The ACT Party has been out here in the community. We are listening, we hear you, and we're here to work for New Zealand. We want more substance over spin. We want policies that unite New Zealanders rather than divide us. And we want to have hope that tomorrow will be better than today. And we need real change and a change of this government.
Madam Speaker.
I call on Mark Cameron for 5 minutes.
Cyclone Gabrielle was terrible, is beyond debate. The damage, devastation, lives lost, many lives upended. So many in the provinces were the hardest hit. Whole properties changed forever, crops destroyed, with a loss in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Silt by the mile in many places, feet or even metres deep. Communities banded together despite these mammoth challenges. They continued to unite behind their shared common humanity, as Kiwis always do in crisis. Cyclone Hale, but weeks earlier, left Auckland awash, inundated, floodwaters abreast buildings, businesses and homes, and even in the shared turmoil, generosity and kindness, a place of Kiwis helping Kiwis, always shone through. We know of the physical havoc, the emotional scars. For some, this will last days, others weeks or even months, especially for those the hardest hit, Hawke's Bay, Gisborne, Northland and beyond. But Madam Speaker, there is a parallel often, to me, offered by those in the rural sector, a parallel that speaks to a different kind of reality, contextualised as a different kind of cyclone, you might say, a different kind of struggle, a war of attrition, they tell me. Farmers speak of foul winds of compliance blowing all over rural New Zealand, carrying mountains upon mountains of red tape and unnecessary bureaucracy, seemingly often laying waste to the emotional well-being of farmers and rural folk. We hear the snide retorts from the other side of the House routinely, but most do not share in their reality. Sure, financial grants help, no doubt, but no one knows of the minefields, red tape that remain long after the clean-up, other than farmers. Madam Speaker, rural confidence is at an all-time recorded low, 50-year low. How can this be when we hear plaudits from up on high? Farmers and rural folk speak their truth unashamedly. I and many of them do it routinely. They ask of this government, cut the red tape, be rid of the nonsensical lawmaking that we are facing in rural New Zealand, from those high of moral fibre but of little consequential knowledge of the outcomes that affect us as farmers. In the enormity of the recent events, farmers, small-town NZers, they need lawmakers to really be connected with reality. We say yes in rural New Zealand. They speak of hundreds of thousands of tonnes currently of silt covering farms, orchards, and a mess of rotten fruit for miles to see. They ask of government, when you remove the foot of the throat of rural New Zealanders, we will finally see better outcomes. As the challenges only mount, farmers speak of a pricing structure for on-farm emissions in consternation, abject disdain, freshwater reforms and centralisations over localism, disconnections from outcomes they speak of, bloated RMA reforms. What will they make of that in rural New Zealand? None seem to know. as we across rural New Zealand deal with a mess of destruction, sedimentation and the slash, one can only ask, will prescriptions in the existing RMA hamper the debris removal and hamstring recovery? Well, the ACT Party is listening to them. We know councils need agility now more than ever before to move away from central planned models and actually listen to real people on the ground in rural New Zealand. We don't need more hoops to jump through in rural New Zealand. We have way too many already. No more harebrained schemes where problems remain ill-defined and solutions are often routinely misunderstood. Now more than ever, the government must work alongside rural New Zealand, listen and invest in tenable outcomes, and the Act is helping them share their concerns in doing that very thing.
Honourable Giantonetti.
That this debate be now adjourned.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. This debate is adjourned and set down for resumption next sitting day.
Madam Speaker.
Honourable Kieran McAnulty.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move that urgency be accorded the passing through all stages of the Road User Charges Temporary RUC Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill No. 2 and the Returning Offenders Management and Information Amendment Bill. Madam Speaker, by moving this motion, I am asking the House to consider and pass two bills, both of which need to be enacted with urgency. On the 1st of February, the Government announced a package of cost of living support for families and businesses. This included the reintroduction of the Road User Charge Discount. The Road User Charges Temporary RUC Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill No. 2 enables the reintroduction to take place. It is intended that the reintroduction discount will come into effect on the 1st of March. It is therefore essential that the bill is passed under urgency. The Returning Offenders Management and Information Amendment Bill is intended to clarify that the Principal Act applies to returning offenders whose offending predated the Act's commencement on the 18th of November 2015, following a High Court decision that called this into question. The bill also provides that the Commissioner of Police must not provide notice or the right to be heard to the affected person before making determinations about their status as a returning prisoner. The quick enactment of this bill is essential to ensure that returning offenders are treated appropriately according to the level of threat that they present. Madam Speaker, I would like to acknowledge members of the Business Committee following a constructive discussion about today's business at the committee meeting yesterday.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. A party vote has been called for. Could the clerk conduct a party vote?
New Zealand Labour.
64 votes in favour.
New Zealand National.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand.
10 against.
ACT New Zealand.
10 votes opposed.
Te Pāti Māori.
2 opposed.
The ayes are 98, the noes are 22. The motion is agreed to.
Madam Speaker.
Honourable Michael Wood.
I present a legislative statement on the Road User Charges Temporary RUC Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill No. 2, 2023.
Could the Minister just try that again? There was no, according to my notes, there is no 2023, and we'll just go by with what I've got.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I present a legislative statement on the Road User Charges Temporary RUC Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill No. 2.
That legislative statement is published under the authority of the House and can be found on the Parliament website. Honourable Michael Wood.
Madam Speaker, I move that the Road User Charges Temporary RUC Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill No. 2 be now read a first time. Madam Speaker, as the Prime Minister has outlined in his statement to this House this week, our government's top priority continues to be addressing the cost of living pressures that many New Zealand households face. And one of the most important steps that we took to address those pressures last year was the temporary reductions in rates of fuel excise duty and road user charges alongside half-price public transport. These measures provided a direct way of providing significant and ongoing financial support to nearly all Kiwi households as they have been dealing with cost of living pressures. Fuel excise duty was reduced by 25 cents per litre of fuel reduced, and to ensure a comparable reduction in rates of road user charges, those rates were reduced by 36%. And that ensured that drivers of diesel vehicles, both private and commercial, received the same level of support as those driving petrol vehicles. That support has been extremely important for families between March of last year and this time. The estimates that we can apply to the reductions that people have been received, if we take someone with filling up with petrol, a 60-litre tank, that person will save approximately $17 every time they fill up their tank with petrol. And the same proportionate reduction in costs would apply to someone filling up their tank with diesel as well. For public transport users, someone taking 2 trips per day to get to and from work with a $5 bus fare would be saving approximately $25 per week. So while we acknowledge that there are still real pressures on many families, this policy has made a tangible difference and is an example of our government's commitment to doing practical things to help Kiwi families at this time. While New Zealand has seen sustained reductions in petrol prices over recent months due to international factors, which are the fundamental drivers of the increases that we have seen in recent times, such as the war in Ukraine and strained post-COVID supply chains, we do know that those cost of living pressures do continue to persist. And the government has made the decision that as a way of providing further practical support, a further extension of this policy is a good and helpful step for us to take. For this reason, we have extended the cut to fuel excise duty, and now is the time through this legislative process to reinstate road user charge rates to that reduced rate of 36% lower than the ordinary rates. Road user charges, as I think most members of the House will be aware, largely apply to diesel vehicles, and they're paid by the kilometre in advance of travel. So it's quite a different system from the fuel excise duty that is effectively built in to the price that you pay at the pump if a person is going to get petrol for their vehicle. The system works by drivers purchasing a set number of kilometres and displaying that licence on their windshield, and then the number of, or electronically via an eRUC licence, and then the number on the vehicle's hubometer or odometer must be within the range that is stated on that displayed RUC licence. The particular complexity with road user charges as compared to fuel excise duty is that there are over 200 different rates of road user charges, and these relate to different weights of vehicles and different axle loads. Broadly speaking, heavier vehicles pay a higher rate of road user charge to take into account the greater degree of damage that they cause to the road and therefore the greater cost in maintaining that road. And if that weight is spread out over a greater axle load, that is also calculated as well. So the simplest way of this change being made is through a piece of regulation that simply instructs the road user charge collector, that is Waka Kotahi, to reduce the rates across the board by 36%. The previous reduction expired on the 1st of February, and so this piece of legislation being pursued through urgency ensures that we are able to reinstate that reduction to the benefit of Kiwi motorists as soon as we can. The bill is straightforward, as I've outlined. It puts in place a second temporary reduction period for road user charge rates, which will run between the 1st of March 2023 and the 30th of June 2023, and the rate of reduction, that 36%, will simply be the same as the rate of reduction which has been in place previously. Importantly, this bill will also create an ability to extend the road user charge reductions beyond the 30th of June by order in council. And that means that if that is deemed to be an appropriate thing to do at that time, it will create some flexibility to do so through a more simple and more streamlined process. One of the other processes that we have built in and will continue to build in to this reduction are some controls to ensure that we manage against the possibility of excessive purchasing. Because the nature of the road user charge system is that people purchase the licence in advance of using it, we do not want to have a situation in which people over-purchase at the reduced rate and effectively take advantage of a temporary scheme. The vast majority of people, of course, won't do that, but a small number might. And out of fairness for all payers into the system, we need to protect against that. And so there are two ways in which we manage that risk. Firstly, to discourage bulk purchasing, what we put in place is a process whereby the reduced rates expire 1 month after the end of the period of temporary reduction. And this is built out of procedures that are already in the Road User Charges Act that apply to purchases of road user charges for heavy vehicles. So that means that people can purchase for the period, and there's a little period beyond that, but purchasing that goes beyond that is not permissible. Secondly, to address and prevent road users from bulk purchasing amounts, the Road User Charges Act does give Waka Kotahi the power to issue assessments for invoice where they believe that that purchasing has been excessive, unreasonable or abusive of the scheme's intent. Now, Waka Kotahi has been monitoring purchasing behaviour since the reductions were put in place and has found a small number of cases where they believe that has been the case, and they have undertaken enforcement action. So the government does want to send the message clearly that this is a policy which is there to support Kiwi households and businesses at a difficult time, but we won't tolerate people who take advantage of the scheme in those small number of cases, and the agency have the tools they need to follow up on that. It's anticipated that most road users will seek to purchase road user charges at the reduced rate either through Waka Kotahi's website or at an approved road user charges agent, and local AA branches are a common place that people do that. So that will be available for people to do during February 2023 at standard rates. To ensure that they can benefit from the reduced rate, vehicle owners will be able to purchase what is known as an overlap licence. With an overlap licence, the licence begins on the current odometer or hubometer reading at the time of purchase, and the unused distance on an existing licence will be automatically credited to offset the new licence cost, and that effectively means that those people get the benefit of the reduced rate for the time at which it is applicable. The final thing that I wish to comment on for the benefit of the House is the way in which this program of reductions will be funded. Across reductions for both fuel excise duty and road user charges, the estimated total reduction in revenue into the NLTF for this period will be in the order of $700 to $750 million. So it is a significant investment that has been made. That amount of money is effectively coming off the fuel bills of Kiwi households, and the government is absorbing that cost. So it is a significant investment to relieve cost of living pressures. Now, it is important that we do continue to invest across the transport program. We see that obviously in the huge amount of work that is ahead of us in cleaning up after the floods and the cyclone. So it's important for people to understand that the government will refund the reduced revenue into the National Land Transport Fund with direct funding from the Crown. So there is no reduction in the transport spend across New Zealand as a result of this policy, and I think that is something that people will want to know as a part of this piece of legislation. So, Madam Speaker, in finishing, this is obviously an important and practical way of addressing cost of living pressures. There have been other proposals, for example, around changes to tax rates that would not deliver anything near the benefit of this policy to Kiwi households. Once again, a Kiwi family filling up a 60-litre tank of petrol on a weekly basis saves $17. A public transport user and the associated part of this policy potentially saves $20 to $25 a week. So it's a tangible difference to Kiwi households. It speaks to our commitment to focusing on those bread and butter issues of cost of living. I commend the bill to the House and look forward to the debate to come. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Madam Speaker.
Simeon Brown.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to take a call on this piece of legislation, the Road User Charges Temporary Ruck Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill number 2, the temporary ruck reduction, which is temporary forever, it seems. And I saw the Minister he's speaking on the bill, and he really didn't want to be speaking on this bill. He really didn't want to be speaking on the bill because he has continued to issue press releases saying that this temporary ruck reduction is about to end. He's been continually saying this will be ending. Well, firstly, it was only to be in place for 3 months, and then another 3 months, then another 3 months, and then he finally issued a press release on the 14th of December, along with Grant Robertson, where they said the government has invested over $1 billion over the past year to reduce fuel prices. However, it is not sustainable to continue to subsidise the cost of petrol indefinitely for everyone, forever. We have to strike a balance between broad ongoing support and careful management of the government accounts. That's why we're transitioning to a more targeted support for those most feeling the pinch. It said then the road user charge discount will end on January the 31st, 2023. RUC is not being extended because it is pre-purchased. That was the Minister of Finance back in 14th of December. Then Michael Wood said, it is important to get the balance right, though, as these policies are not without significant costs. We've got to make sure they are sustainable when their duty and fares help make up the funding we use to fix our roads and invest in public transport, cycling and walking infrastructure. That was last year, and this is now. The petrol excise cut will be 25 cents per litre until the end of June. And so now it's been extended. And that is, of course, the Minister standing up, giving a speech which I'm sure he did not want to give. But the point here, Madam Speaker, of this piece of legislation is not to do necessarily with the broad-based policy decision around whether the extension should have been done or not. That's obviously the politics that this government has realised it still has not addressed the cost of living crisis New Zealanders are facing. That's the reason why we're here, is because this government has still not actually dealt with the underlying causes of inflation. It hasn't dealt with the fact that New Zealanders are paying too much tax, that we are being pushed higher and higher into higher income tax brackets, meaning Kiwi working families are paying more tax under this government. They still have wasting hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. They're continuing with a whole range of policy programs like 3 Waters, which is costing enormous amounts of money, which is not, well, it's had a name change. I don't know what its new name is, but it's having a name change. It's having a reset, it's going to be 5 Waters. 5 Waters, says Mr. Ping. The point is, though, Madam Speaker, this government is not dealing with the underlying causes of inflation. So all they've got is to put in place and to extend this policy. That's the only idea they've got, is to extend this policy. But, Madam Speaker, this bill does do an important thing, and that is why we will be supporting it, is because what it does is it ensures that our diesel drivers and our truck drivers get the cut as well as our petrol excise, or the petrol car users as well. Currently, people who drive a truck or a diesel vehicle are having to pay the full rate again, because this government last year said we're going to finish this at the end of January, and that's it. And of course, then on the 1st of February, which was the day afterwards, they didn't decide to maybe think about doing this before that announcement, before the actual RUC finish. They decided, well, actually, we're going to extend it on the 1st, and they decided to make that announcement on the 1st of February. So, of course, our diesel vehicle users, our tradies, our farmers, our truck drivers, the people who move our goods, our exports to ports, they're having to pay the higher rate now. And so what this bill does is it does extend that same reduction in road user charge, the 36% reduction that the Minister spoke about. It does extend it to those users as well. And that is important because ultimately this government otherwise would just be giving the reduction to people who drive a petrol vehicle. And that would be completely unfair to give the reduction to people who use petrol, but not to pass on that reduction to people who use diesel. And so what this piece of legislation does is it creates that fairness, and we are glad the government's finally bringing it to the House a couple of weeks after it was actually announced. But I think what that speaks to is that this is ad hoc policy on the fly by a government which doesn't actually have a plan to deal with inflation. It doesn't have a plan to deal with inflation because it doesn't actually know how it's going to fix inflation in New Zealand. It's a government which knows how to spend big. It's a government which knows how to dream up new taxes. Heard about a flood tax today. They're now thinking about a flood tax. And in terms of when it comes to actually trying to deal with these issues, the only idea they've actually had is to put in place a temporary, which I'm sure has been welcomed. It has been welcomed by many people, or everyone who drives their vehicles have welcomed some relief, because it's the only relief that this government has ever given. And let me just make another point, Madam Speaker. The 25-cent reduction in petrol excise, this government might say, well, we're reducing petrol excise by 25 cents. Well, that sounds really interesting. But if you're an Auckland motorist, you've had your excise increased by 12 cents under this government, and you've had the Auckland regional fuel tax put in place, meaning you're paying a 23.5 cents per litre more in excise. So actually, all this government is doing for Aucklanders is actually just taking the excise back to what it was before they came to office. So this government is a government which knows how to tax, it knows how to waste, but it doesn't know how to actually deliver and fix the problems that New Zealanders are facing. And there's one other point that I just want to make, Madam Speaker, which is this bill, and the Minister only touched on this very briefly, but this bill includes a 5-year extension for the government to be able to continue to keep the temporary reduction in RUC in place, a 5-year extension. So when the Minister of Transport said, or the Minister of Finance said on the 1st of February, this extension takes us to the end of the financial year, we've already indicated that the budget will have a cost of living focus. Well, I should have thought about that last year. And this extension covers the time until that comes into force, which is, of course, the end of June. Well, I'm sorry, but my prediction is this will be extended again, because that's what this legislation does provide for. And what we're saying to the government is we need a real plan to deal with the underlying causes of inflation. The National Land Transport Fund is a hypothecated fund to help build and maintain our roading networks. This government has absolutely stripped the funding from that fund. It has poured it into pet projects. It has taken it away from our state highways and our local roads. It has let our roads be deteriorated. Potholes are peppering our highways. And we actually need to make sure we do restore the integrity of that fund. But what this government is doing is effectively giving themselves a blank cheque. And so what we're saying is, yes, we support this piece of legislation. It aligns the temporary excise reduction with the temporary RUC reduction, which is critically important to our farmers, our tradies, our truckies, those who are moving goods around New Zealand, getting our goods to market. It's critically important to doing that. But what this government desperately needs to bring is actually a real plan to deal with inflation, get the cost of living under control so that New Zealanders aren't faced with higher and higher interest rates, a higher cost of living. Their incomes are going up slower than inflation. Those are the issues that really matter to hardworking Kiwis, and we're wanting a plan from this government to address it. And guess what? If they don't, we will. On October the 14th, New Zealanders will have a choice, and we will deliver a plan to actually deal with these issues, get the cost of living under control, and actually get New Zealanders back in the driving seat of their own lives.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I am pleased to stand and speak on the Road User Charges Amendment Bill this evening. And there was so much in that last speech, and now is not the time for politics, because the reality of this particular bill, Madam Speaker, is that it speaks to the hearts of Aucklanders driving around in current times who are feeling the pressures of the cost of living. This government is being pragmatic. It's getting on with the ability to actually walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, we have to deal with the here and now. We have to deal with the cost of living challenges, and petrol, the cost of petrol is certainly a part of that. But when we start to throw out pet projects, and the next one will be that suddenly there is challenges from the other side, actually, that we don't need a second harbour connection, do we? Actually, these things are important to deal with Aucklanders moving around right now, and our ability to plan for a modern transport system and infrastructure to help people get around and move in our largest city. So, Madam Speaker, without further ado, I think it's important to acknowledge this particular bill. It deals with the cost of living challenges that are in front of us, and I commend this bill to the House.
I call Simon Watt.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and an absolute pleasure to rise on the Road User Charges Temporary RUC Reduction Scheme
Amendment Bill number 2. And as the prior, well, not the prior speaker, I want to just call out the speaker, Simeon Brown, for his articulation in regards to this bill, which, while National will be supporting this bill because it obviously deals with a key element of inconsistency in the charging process, it reinforces a government that does not have a plan to deal with the underlying issue, the number one issue in this country, Madam Speaker, which is inflation. And that is the reality. So this bill's coming in, and it's going to be a adjustment to extend this reduction for diesel users. And I think has been canvassed previously, in effect, the element that surprisingly the Minister did not mention in the speech, which is a key component, is he's given himself an open chequebook. He's given himself an open chequebook of 5 years to continue to extend this temporary reduction.
But he won't last 5 years, so it won't matter.
I don't know, what time is it? Kids back from school? Kids will be back from school by now. But I can tell you what, I'm not sure what the definition of temporary is for those at home. But the last time I looked, Madam Speaker, 5 years is not temporary.
This government's temporary.
But Simeon Brown saying this government's temporary. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. But I know that Kiwis are sensible and they can see through this. The reality is, Madam Speaker, that in regards to this legislation, there is no doubt that people are hurting out there across this country as a result of the cost of living crisis. But this government is responsible for much of that hurt and for driving elements of this cost of living crisis that we face today. But they continually say it's because of overseas factors. It's not our fault. They sort of forget that as government, you sort of have the levers to be able to make decisions and fiscal policy implications that actually change and have influences on what happens here in New Zealand. But no. It's a result of global factors. I'm sorry. The most recent, and we challenged today around some of the stuff, around the fact that actually when you look at those global constraints, they are cooling. A number of those factors that are driving the constraints, which are feeding the cost of living crisis, of which this bill is trying to address, are actually cooling in the international arena. And so that reinforces that this government are out of ideas. This is the only idea, this bill is the only idea that they have been managed to come up with to deal with the cost of living crisis. And have they had a little bit of time to prepare this plan to deal with the cost of living crisis? Have they had time between when this last came through the House and now to come up with other options? Well, of course they have. But have they done anything about it? No, of course not. All they've done is, you know what, let's just renew this. Let's kick it to touch. Let's buy time, buy a temporary amount of time, which is 5 years, which in itself is completely inconsistent. And I've done another example of band-aid economics. This is a band-aid. This is of no substance, no sustainable basis in order to deal with the core elements driving our cost of living crisis. And Madam Speaker, that's a real shame. That is a real shame for those people across this country that are hurting due to the implications of that cost of living crisis, that this government is not taking their role seriously. They are not taking accountability. They are not taking responsibility for putting in place tangible solutions other than this RUC user charge temporary amendment. No tangible solutions to actually deal with the core root cause of inflation, which is crippling Kiwi households across this country. And that is completely unacceptable. One example, let's just throw some ideas out there. Of course, National have articulated our 5-point plan for dealing with the cost of living crisis. And we put it out, Madam Speaker, last year. So it's not like it's anything new. It's just a shame that the government actually haven't literally read it and decided to implement it, because I tell you what, New Zealand would be far better off today than where we are if the government had simply taken a little bit of advice from this side of the house, taken a little bit of leadership, listened to Kiwis across this country who are hurting, and actually implemented some changes. And one of those changes, quite simply, is getting rid of the waste, the bureaucracy and waste, hard-earned taxpayer dollars coming out of the back pockets of hard-working Kiwis. And you know what, Madam Speaker, in regards to this legislation where they think the solution is a road user charge amendment bill, they haven't thought about the fact, why don't we fire those high-priced consultants that are undertaking advisory work on the Three Waters legislation, which the majority of Kiwis think it is an absolutely wasteful idea, $30 million of a consultants, hireage of officers in Freeman Bay in Auckland. That is an example, Madam Speaker, of wastage taxpayers' money, which this government have not done anything about. It is on their watch that instead of taking sustainable solutions to deal with the cost of living crisis and inflation, they resort to just simply amending a band-aid solution. And that, again, reinforces that the cost of government is driving up the cost of living. The cost of that government is driving up the cost of living. $1 billion, Madam Speaker, more every single week is spent by that government than what occurred before they came into this House. And that, Madam Speaker, is a large majority of that is wastage, which is driving up the cost of living. And as a result of them failing to recognise that their actions are driving the situation which Kiwis are facing at home, they have to resort to this type of band-aid legislation in order to simply temporarily as we've said, undefined, or has got a new definition under this government, to increase the charges. And that is, that is a great shame. So we talked about the high-priced consultants in Three Waters and those ones that are in those lovely offices. We talk about the $2.5 billion of no worse off funding for Three Waters. And we talk about that. And all of the other examples. I didn't talk about the Cycle Bridge, $51 million. I heard the member from Northcote before saying, look, don't bring politics into that, but the second sentence after that was about the Cycle Bridge or the Harbour Crossing. So a little bit ironic. But the reality is that wastage and this government is driving up the cost of living, and that is unacceptable. Madam Speaker, as my colleague Simeon Brown said right from the start, the element of driving consistency in terms of this legislation is important. We will be supporting it. But I think Kiwis can be under no illusion that this is a band-aid solution. The cost of this government is driving up the cost of living. Kiwis are hurting, and this government is responsible for much of that hurt. Thank you, Mr.
Paul, Rachel Boyack.
Speaker, it's a pleasure to take a short call on the Road User Charges Temporary Rut Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill. Madam Speaker, this bill ensures that road users with diesel vehicles are also provided with a reduction in the cost of their transport, as we have done for those who receive a cut in fuel excise duty and half-price public transport. Madam Speaker, I just want to comment on the previous speaker's comments around inflation and note that the biggest driver of inflation is the cost of fuel around the globe, Madam Speaker. It is international-based inflation, and it's the cost of transport that is driving up the cost of food in New Zealand. And so the biggest step we can take is to reduce the cost of transport for Kiwi households and Kiwi businesses to address the cost of living. And we are doing something about that, Madam Speaker. This bill reflects the Labor government's continued commitment to addressing the cost of living for Kiwi families and businesses, and I commend it to the House.
Honourable Julianne Genter.
Madam Speaker, as it's my first contribution in the House this year, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of those who've been affected by the severe floods in Auckland and Cyclone Gabrielle right across the country. And I know that there's a whole lot of people whose lives and livelihoods have been severely affected by this storm. And my heart goes out to them, and I want to acknowledge that we have a responsibility. I know everyone would agree with this, that we have a responsibility in this House to make sure that those who are the most vulnerable and who are the most affected receive the support and the help that they need during this difficult time. And ultimately, these storms, we know, have been exacerbated. The impacts were exacerbated by human-caused climate change, which is something that the Green Party has been talking about in this House for well over 25 years now. And we need to do something about it. And we need to tackle all of our challenges, our economic challenges and our ecological challenges together. Otherwise, we are not going to solve the problem. And that's why the Green Party does not support this bill. We need long-term investment to ensure that our transport system is not so reliant on fossil fuels. And if we had had that for the past 25 years, as the Green Party had been calling for, then we wouldn't need to take these measures because people wouldn't be so affected by fluctuations in the price of fuel. Unfortunately, if we keep taking a short-term response, which is trying to address short-term challenges with high prices of fuel, as they are doing in this bill, and of course with the reduction in fuel excise duty, we never do anything to get a transport system that is less reliant on fossil fuels, that's more energy efficient, that has significant productivity benefits for New Zealand, but most of all, that enables New Zealanders and the natural world that we live in to thrive. And that's what we need to do. We can't just keep taking such a short-term approach. And, you know, I know one of the reasons that is cited by the government for this approach is that it was able to be rolled out quickly. But this is, what, the third or fourth extension? It's now almost a year since this measure was first considered. And certainly, as officials recommended and the Treasury recommended, the government could have, by now, implemented a different approach that would have benefited low to middle income households in a much more direct and supportive way. Because as the post-implementation regulatory assessment says, the poorest households are spending considerably less money on petrol and diesel, on fuel, than the highest income households. So the cost of this policy, which is well over $1 billion, just on the reduction to fuel excise and RUC, more of that is going to the very highest income people who are the least affected by high inflation. They are the least affected by cost of living pressures. So the government could have afforded to give at least as much support, perhaps more, to the households who need it most at this time. And they could have done even more than that. They could have, extended subsidies for public transport, made it free for key portions of the population, and increased the services in public transport. So, because the cost of half-price public transport is like 1/10 of what the cost of the RUC and the Fed discount is. It's hard to explain, Madam Speaker, how ephemeral this benefit is. It's basically money that we're putting out there and it just disappears. It does nothing to help us combat the climate crisis. It does nothing to help households transition to lower carbon ways of getting around. It does nothing to save money on fuel in the future. It's only for this very moment, in this period of time, that, and at this moment in time, Madam Speaker, we have to acknowledge that the oil companies are making record profits globally. And that's how broken our economic system is. That in 2022, the major oil companies made basically $100 billion in after-tax profit. And a lot of that money was put towards share buybacks, which increased the wealth of their shareholders. So in the sense of the global economy, people are being financially rewarded for corporate behavior, the very activities that are causing the climate crisis, that is causing floods and storms that are affecting ordinary people and taking their lives and livelihoods. It's deranged, and it's something that we have the power to change. We don't have to accept this. In New Zealand, the corporate profits of fossil fuel companies are not as egregious as they are on the global scale, but they are making, in the past year, they've posted hundreds of millions in profits. And so at the very time that the public is paying, trying to alleviate cost of living and high price of fuel, Z Energy and Mobil and BP are earning hundreds of millions in profits. So clearly something is out of alignment, and we need to have just a slightly longer term view on how we solve these crises. And they need to be motivated. Our solutions need to be aligned with the values that people hold most dear. People care about nature, they care about the planet, they care about where they live. They want to do the right thing. They want to have options to get around, to earn a living, to see their family and friends, to live in decent conditions. All of that is possible if we don't prioritize protecting privatized profits of big corporate fossil fuel companies, and if we prioritize the well-being of the people in this country. So I know the Labour government talks a good game on well-being, but the reality is that this policy falls well short. It's counterproductive. It's making emissions worse. Some of the benefit of this policy, not only is it benefiting the highest income people most, but some of the benefit will be perceived by petrol companies, and it will be reflected in their profits. So at some point, we need to stop privatizing the profit and gain and socializing the losses, and we need to take a medium and long-term view on how we can help people. Is it true that not everyone can take public transport? Yes, absolutely, and that is always going to be the case. But, you know, if we had prioritized more investment in public transport and active transport, then more people would be able to get around without having to spend so much money on oil and on fossil fuels. So it is true that not everybody will benefit from half-price public transport, but we could spend money supporting the lowest income people, the people who need it the most. We could give them more money on a weekly basis rather than spending this money subsidizing fossil fuel use, and the greatest share of which of the benefit will be perceived by the richest New Zealanders and the fossil fuel companies. That's why this policy doesn't make sense. The Green Party won't be supporting it. We will continue to support sensible investment in a transport system that isn't so reliant on fossil fuels, that gives people real options and real choices. One of the ironies of, I guess, the political debate on our transport system here in New Zealand just doesn't recognize that essentially decades of planning only for cars forces a huge cost onto households. It's not about freedom. Like at this point, if you have to use a car and you have to own a car to get around because government hasn't sufficiently invested in an efficient and reliable public transport system, that is a huge tax on New Zealanders because they have to spend thousands of dollars every year owning their car, parking their car, fueling their car, insuring the car. And Simeon Brown says he chooses to own a car, but I hate to tell you this, Simeon, not everybody is in that situation. There's a whole lot of people who don't have a choice, and it's because of decisions made by subsequent governments. And what the Green Party is advocating for is choice. It means a community where children can get around without having to be ferried everywhere by their parents in a car, where they can walk and cycle safely. Yeah, that's a tax on your household, Simeon. It is. You don't even realize that
Order. I'll just ask the member is straying dangerously into barracking, and if the member could please address that member by his full name. Julianne Genter, Honourable Julianne Genter.
I think it's very endearing. It's very cute the way that Simeon Brown and those on the right believe that it's their freedom of choice to spend thousands and thousands of dollars that benefit automobile manufacturers and oil companies. That's the great trick that the oil industry and the automobile industry played on society for 50 years, which is it's your choice, it's your freedom to spend 25 to 40% of your income on a vehicle and fuel to get around, when in fact, if the public invested in a high quality public transport system, you would have choice. And of course, some people will still use cars and that's fine, but we need low carbon choices for people.
Simon Court.
Oh, look, Madam Speaker, forgive me. This bill has come under urgency, and so it's taken a little bit of quick reading to work out exactly where this government has gone wrong again. ACT supported the government's proposal to give motorists a break with a discount on the petrol excise duty and road user charges when that was proposed in March 2022. At the time, there'd been a spike in the price of fuel as a result of the dictator Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine. But it turns out that, like any crisis that has befallen New Zealand under this Labour government, they've used that as an excuse, and we've heard members like Rachel Boyer continuing to restate this falsehood that petrol prices are still high because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what this graph shows, when you look at the government's own data, their regulatory impact statement, that indeed, in March 2022, fuel prices spiked to over $3 a litre for petrol. But like all kinds of fact-adjacent proposals offered by this government, this graph omits another whole year of data. Because in fact, the fuel price now is back to what it was before Russia invaded Ukraine. And so the basis of the Labour Party's and Minister Michael Wood's argument that it's necessary to give Kiwis a break in terms of the cost of living is not justified by his own regulatory impact assessment. Now, the problem that this bill causes is not just that it's bad, rushed lawmaking based on half-truths and facts that are cobbled together to make a poor argument. I also want to address the fundamental problem that the road user charges and the petrol excise duties levied on motorists are insufficient to pay for the amount of roading that we need to deliver, not because the government doesn't collect enough money, but because they siphon off so much of the money collected from motorists to spend on pet projects, wasteful spending like the Auckland Harbour Bike Bridge, $50 to $100 million spent on a project that engineers I know said was unfeasible when it was announced, but they persisted. Or Auckland Light Rail, what could be a wonderful futuristic project to enable land development along that corridor in Auckland between Auckland CBD, the member for Mount Albert's electorate, the Transport Minister's Mount Roskill electorate, and Auckland Airport even. But again, future projects that may be sensible, but we still haven't seen the business case, and that's a $200 million business case. So the problem that the government really should be solving is not how do we offer a cost of living sop to voters in an election year, which is exactly what this policy does. In fact, officials point out if the government wanted to address people who are in hardship because of transport costs, there are other options. There are transfer payments available. There is working for families. There's energy payments. There's all kinds of options the government has to address the cost of living. And this policy officials recommend should not be one of them. But here we are debating whether to extend the discount on road user charges, a discount which will benefit many of my friends in the trucking and heavy transport industry, many of my friends who drive turbo diesel Toyota Surfs on the beach. All of those people will benefit, but unfortunately, while they might benefit today, this policy is costing $115 million a month in foregone revenue. By the end of January 2023, this policy had cost $1.3 billion in foregone revenue. And when that member, Shannon Halbert, who's the chair of the Transport and Infrastructure Committee, stood up in the House a few minutes ago and made the claim that without this policy we wouldn't be able to afford a new Auckland Harbour crossing, I thought that's the most nonsensical, incoherent thing I've heard since the Prime Minister's statement yesterday. Mr Shannon Halbert, you are the chair of the Transport and Infrastructure Committee of Parliament, and you don't seem to understand the link between the need to raise revenue, not discount revenue, raise revenue in order to deliver infrastructure.
Order. The member is bringing the speaker into the debate, so find another way of expressing himself.
Madam Chair, people watching at home...
Madam Speaker would do.
Madam Speaker, people watching at home must be able to tell how incensed I am as the ACT Transport spokesperson about this appalling piece of legislation. So this takes around $1.3 billion in the last year from the National Land Transport Fund, which is required to be made up by borrowing. That's kicking the can down the road to future citizens, to people who might not even be born yet, to pay back this $1.3 billion this government's already wasted on this policy. So, what would ACT do? What would ACT do? Well, firstly, we would stop lecturing New Zealanders about whether they should be driving less and walking or cycling more. We would stop lecturing New Zealanders about a climate emergency when this government, in cahoots with the Greens, have failed to deliver the climate adaptation bill, even though Greens Climate Minister James Shaw has been the Climate Minister for 5 years. And now we face the real problem. New Zealand's transportation network has been devastated by flooding and storms. This government, previous governments, have not put sufficient money in to upgrade our networks and make them more resilient. When you drive on new highways like Transmission Gully, when you drive on new highways like the Waikato Expressway, you'll see what a resilient highway looked like. And if Waka Kotahi let us, motorists would also be able to drive on the brand new, unopened Puhoi to Warkworth Highway on State Highway 1 north of Auckland. But for contractual reasons, Waka Kotahi won't let motorists on it. So what's the problem to solve? How do we raise sufficient funds to deliver a safe, efficient, that means get where you're going at a decent clip, safe, efficient and resilient transport network funded by motorists, the people who use it, in a way that means what you pay for you get. And in some cases that might mean that we need to apply road pricing, what people in the olden days used to call tolls. Imagine that, you could toll the road like the Auckland Harbour Bridge and then you'd get a new harbour bridge. Now, that institutional memory appears to have been forgotten by this government and its officials, but ACT hasn't forgotten. In fact, in our solutions for building New Zealand and conserving nature, we make the case for road pricing. We don't just make the case for road pricing, we make the case as to how in 5 short years New Zealand could transition from road user charges...
Order. I'm going to ask the member to come back more closely to the bill. It is in order to make passing reference to other matters in context, but the main purpose of this bill is to address the first reading of this Transport RUC bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So it's possible in 5 short years to transition from road user charges and fuel excise duties to a system of electronic road pricing. This has been done elsewhere in the world. The ACT Party proposes that should be a much better alternative.
I've just asked the member to come back to this more closely to the bill. This is the second time I'm inviting him to do so.
Madam Speaker, so in the regulatory impact assessment, officials identify a number of different options. And of course, road pricing, charging people for the roads they drive on, is in the mix. Now, it's fair to say that when you rush legislation into the House under urgency, and it's so urgent, I want to draw the House's attention to this, it's so urgent that in the section Constraints on Analysis, officials point out that commissioning was narrow in scope and advice and needed to be provided quickly. The advice was sought on lowering petrol excise and road user charges. Well, that's remarkable because the government announced the reduction in taxes on road user charges and petrol excise duty over a year ago. And yet it appears the request for information from officials was made very, very shortly before this policy was announced, this extension on road user charges and fuel excise duty. So that would lead me to conclude, in fact, the policy is poorly thought out, The costs have not been considered adequately. The benefits are very limited, except to reduce the cost of petrol to motorists in an election year. And for that reason, ACT will not be supporting this bill. It does not address our long-term needs.
Honourable Porter Williams.
Madam Speaker, it's always a rare and special privilege to follow on from the ACT Party and taking a call on this bill. The ACT Party, who would have one believe, who's listening to his contribution, have one believe that the largesse and public goodness of the oil companies would forego their profits in time of national need, which would mean that we wouldn't need this legislation to go through, which is clearly false. And the requirement for the government to take steps to ensure that people who need to use vehicles, to get about their daily business, or to transport goods and services around the country do not need support to do that by this government is clearly wrong. So, Madam Speaker, we know the reason for this bill, to extend the reduction in RUC to ensure that those people who do need to get to work, need to get to school, need to get about their business can do so, and that transporters, people who freight our goods and services around the country, can do so in a way that actually reduces the costs to New Zealanders during this cost of living crisis. Madam Speaker, I do want to make one comment. It would be remiss of me not to recognise today as the 12th anniversary of the earthquakes in Christchurch and in Canterbury, and my colleague and I share with our people in Canterbury the thoughts of 12 years on from that day. Madam Speaker, my final thoughts, I do want to kind of pose the question, what kind of life experiences could have created someone as cynical as Simeon Brown, who made some extraordinary statements in this House today, who said there was I've yet to find evidence of that, Mr Brown, when saying that the National Party would support this bill. He didn't find it necessary to have this bill, wanted us to do more for the folk who were impacted by the cost of living, but didn't believe in this bill. So on those final thoughts, Madam Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Chris Pink, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As some others have done, I just wish to briefly acknowledge those who are in dire straits even now still as a result of recent extreme weather events throughout New Zealand, including my own electorate. I'll welcome the opportunity to speak more fully on that subject in the House later. On the subject of this bill, the road user charges temporary RUC. I'm looking at this through road-tinted spectacles, Madam Speaker, because actually it's been a long time now since this first came in. I fear I'm in danger of misleading the House, even using the word temporary in relation to it, but it's in the title of the bill, so at risk of incurring your wrath, or indeed that of your replacement, I note that that is at least what it says on the tin. The can has been kicked down the road. Eventually the can will fall into a pothole, no doubt, and I'll finish this brief contribution with a reflection that as someone much wiser than me once observed, there's nothing so permanent as a temporary solution, to which what we might also say in this day and age, there's nothing so permanent as nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. So this extension of an extension of extension, we have supported on the basis as set out by our transport spokesperson, Simeon Brown.
I call on Dr Tracy McLellan.
Madam Speaker, and I'll make a brief call also on this Road Users Charge Temporary RUC Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill. Madam Speaker, as is obvious in this bill, the government's obvious top priority is simply helping New Zealanders with the cost of living amid what is a heightened inflation around the world. It's not novel to New Zealand, it's something that many people are experiencing around the world, but there are practical, sensible things that we can do as a government to help alleviate that pain for people. So on the basis of that, Madam Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Now
I call on Nacy Chen.
I don't know if it was picked up by Hansard, but the Honourable Willie Jackson here just said thank you for your support, and I think that needs to be echoed throughout the House. This is our bill of support with those who are going through the tough times right now in terms of the cost of living. We know that reducing RUC, we know that reducing petrol exercise actually helps with the inflationary pressures as well on our economy right now, and so this is a good bill. That's why I commend this bill to the House.
I call on Honourable David Bennett.
I thought you were going to say pink there for a second. I was going, jeez.
Sorry about that.
I know he's
Honourable
very
David
rosy,
Bennett.
but there's a difference. You know? Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. First of all, I'd like to also acknowledge those people that in the regions, our coastal regions, have really done it tough in the last few weeks and months. With the weather conditions and what they've had to deal with has been tremendously difficult, and we don't understand that as much as they will, not being there and being part of it, but we think of them, and I'd just like to thank the government for what they've done so far and the gestures of infrastructure to make sure that they've got some support there. And also, unfortunately, the new Prime Minister and Deputy aren't here. My first speech in the House since they've been given the role. I'd just like to congratulate them on their roles and wish them all the best. And I know it's a new leaf, but anyway, but it's not going to last. But Willie, I'll come back to you, mate. Yeah, but well done to them, and congratulations. It's an honour for anyone to be in those roles, so that's great. So, but this bill here, one of these bills, you know, when we look at the transport sector in New Zealand, it's a really important sector when we consider what's actually going on in our coastal regions at the moment. You know, one of the big things we're finding is that our infrastructure has been devastated by those natural disasters. And one way or the other, we have to deal with that. There's going to be the replacement of certain bridges, there'll be the replacement of certain roads, there'll be new roads that will be built. But fundamentally, New Zealand needs to look at its infrastructure in total. And the whole point we have road user charges, and the whole point we have excise tax, is to enable the country to build the road infrastructure, especially our roading and rail networks, that actually enable New Zealand to function. And I just want to take one example and look at that for a moment. And that is north of Auckland to Whangarei. You know, that road has been out of order since the first rains that we had. It is just not acceptable that one of our biggest cities, Whangarei, is effectively isolated from Auckland when it's not that far away. And there have been plans to build a 4-lane road from Auckland to Whangarei for generations. And they have been debated in and out of this House. And we don't do it. My political career has been staked on getting the road from Hamilton to Auckland, and we did get it. But the next stage is actually Auckland to Whangarei. That's an important stage, like it is from Hamilton to Tauranga. And if we don't have that key infrastructure, we abandon those cities and those communities. At the moment, people are having to take a coastal route going around through small towns like Waipu and Mangawhai to get it back to Auckland. The fault is the Labour Party that cancelled the roads of national significance, because the roads of national significance would have created that 4-laning to Whangarei. And that is the fault of Willie Jackson and his team. So when he says whose fault is that, it's directly that government. They have taken money out of building roading infrastructure. They do not believe in roads. The Green Party will say it honestly and objectively, and the Labour Party will do it. They have taken money out to put in their pet rail projects in Auckland City. They have not delivered for New Zealand's infrastructure when they had the point and the chance to do so. And I know we have to rebuild in certain places, but we also need to future-proof our infrastructure. And the Labour Party failed in the last 5 years. It cancelled the infrastructure that would have saved places like Whangarei from what they're going through now. It cancelled the Cambridge extension to Paeri. It cancelled those northern roads in Tauranga. It cancelled the roads that would have been vital for our coastal cities and growth.
The member would like to come back to this bill.
Well,
Thank
the bill
you.
is about the road user charges and excise taxes,
Yes,
and the whole
let's
point of
discuss
those
that.
is to build infrastructure. That's what you do with the roading. It's not there to spend on consultants. It's not there to think about what could be a greater vision for New Zealand that doesn't have cars. That's what the Labour Party and Greens have used the transport budget for. They've politicised Waka Kotahi. They've taken it away from doing the structural developments that are needed for the infrastructure in New Zealand. And that has been the crisis that we are seeing now today. There's always going to be natural disasters. There's always going to be things we have to rebuild. But we could have actually made sure that the people of Whangarei were actually given the ability to link into Auckland if we built that road. And that's the opportunity that's in front of the National Party when they get in at the end of the year to bring back the roads of national significance, to bring back that infrastructure that actually stabilises our economy in some of the most vulnerable parts of the country. Another example is from Napier to Hastings. For so long, those communities have only asked for a decent roading network between those two cities. And for so long, this House has said no. If we had given them an infrastructure there, that would have actually helped them, no doubt, in these kind of situations. There's the connections between the Waikato and the Hawke's Bay, for example. That's an arterial route that is vital for this country. All that government could do is reduce the speed limit to 80 k's on it. It couldn't get to the position where it would invest in the infrastructure of that road. It just wanted to slow it down. Now that road is one of the ones that has been affected by the cyclone and other events. So, Madam Speaker, this bill is a symptom of a government that's failed on infrastructure. It's a government... No, I am going to support it. Yeah, and the reason I'm supporting it is because actually the second thing I was going to get onto is actually good for New Zealand in the sense that when the productive part of New Zealand finally gets some money out of this place, because all this government does is spend money on social spending, at some point, actually the productive sector of New Zealand is actually going to get their taxes back through some money being spent on infrastructure. Well, they're not going to get their taxes back. They're going to get the borrowing that the government's made in actual infrastructure. The rest of the time, the government borrows just for social spending. We don't actually invest in the infrastructure in New Zealand, and the country suffers as a result. So at least this is actually going to help the builders, plumbers, farmers, and family people out there that actually can use the roading network, because at least it's an investment in infrastructure, even if the government is borrowing for it.
The member's got 2 minutes to come back to the Ruck Amendment Bill.
Okay, Madam Speaker, this bill is a demonstration of a missed opportunity for infrastructure in New Zealand. And I think of the people in Whangarei as a great example. They need that four-laning. Our country needs that four-laning. The Labour Party has said no to roads. The Labour Party has an aversion to building roading infrastructure. The Green Party does not like roads either. It's time they woke up and understood in New Zealand we need to build that infrastructure.
I call on Maya Lubeck.
It's a privilege to make a short call on this very important bill. We hear a lot of moaning and whinching from the other side about the fact that they believe we're not doing enough to assist with the cost of living. But whenever we do, they object to everything we do, whether it's objecting to the raising of the minimum wage, whether it's about public transport, halving of the fees, or in this case on the reducing of the road user charges. The fuel excise reductions were really helpful for people that live on my side of the world. For a household with a petrol vehicle, for example, if a person had to fill up each week, they would save roughly about $36 per month. Now, that is very good money for a lot of people that don't have a lot to spend. And so, again, this bill will help people with the cost of living. And why there is so much noise about objecting to that from the other side, I have no idea, but I commend it to the House. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of an opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party vote has been called for. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand Labour.
64 votes in favour.
New Zealand National.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand.
10 votes opposed.
ACT New Zealand.
10 votes opposed.
Te Pāti Māori.
The ayes are 98, the noes are 20. The ayes have it.
Road User Charges Temporary RUC Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill Number 2, first reading.
That bill is set down for second reading immediately. I call on Honourable Willie Jackson.
Madam Speaker, I move that the Road Users Charges Temporary Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill be now read a second time.
Can I ask the member to just read that paragraph out? There was, you had missed out ruck, sorry.
Sorry, Madam Speaker, sorry. Where am I? Where is it?
Temporary ruck reduction scheme.
Oh, sorry, Madam Speaker. I move that the Road Users Charges Temporary RUC Reduction Scheme Amendment Bill number 2 be now read a second time.
Thank you. Honourable Willie Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as mentioned in the Minister's first reading speech, the government's top priority is supporting households with cost living pressures. And of course, that's what our Prime Minister has been saying for the last few weeks. Bread and butter issues is the focus now for this government, and it's a message that is resonating so strongly for our government, so strongly that it's leaving the National Party in the lurch. Madam Speaker, fuel is an unavoidable cost for many New Zealanders. They need to get to work or to make sure their kids get to school. For some small business owners, fuel costs have a real impact on their ability to run their business. We know that many families are facing tough choices right now. For this reason, we have decided to maintain the support measures we first put in place in March and April of 2022. And it's a Cabinet and government who've considered this and realised the needs of New Zealanders around the country. We know that Kiwis are suffering under a lot of the pressures in terms of the costs of living. So this has absolutely been clear that we support them. The extension will run to 30th of June 2023 with full rates of fuel excise duty and road user charges resuming on 1st of July 2023, keeping those measures in place in a way to provide timely and meaningful support to households and businesses across the country. Madam Speaker, the government has already amended regulations to keep the 25 cents per litre reduction to fuel excise duty in place until the 30th of June 2023. Half-price public transport will also remain in place until the 30th of June 2023. We're not backing off our efforts to encourage New Zealanders to get on public transport. We know, Madam Speaker, that this announcement has been well received by people right across the different political spectrum. So we're pleased to see the support that has come across for this policy. The reduction to road user charges expired on 1st of February 2023. For the last 3 weeks, those who need to purchase a road user charges licence have been doing so at full rates. We need to amend the Road Users Charges Act to bring back the reduced rates as quickly as possible. Madam Speaker, the bill is necessary to put in place a second temporary reduction period for road user charger rates. The period will run from 1st of March 2023 until 30th of June 2023. During this time, all legislated rates of road user charges will be reduced by 36%. Settling the reduction at this level helps to ensure that we are providing equivalent support to diesel vehicle owners as we are giving to petrol vehicle owners. At this level of reduction, the price of a road user charges licence for a light diesel vehicle falls from $76 to $49. This means that the owner of a light diesel vehicle will save, Madam Speaker, $27 each time they purchase a licence. The bill does include a power to extend the reduction period by order in council. The international economic outlook remains uncertain and unpredictable. The bill provides the government with the ability to continue this support should the economic conditions warrant it without seeking another amendment to the Road User Charges Act. Madam Speaker, the road user charges system is more complex than fuel excise duty. As the Minister noted in the first reading speech, there are over 200 road user charge rates in more than 80 different vehicle types. Meanwhile, there's one fuel excise duty rate paid as part of the retail price of fuel. Road user charges are based on distance travelled. They must be purchased in advance of travel, and those people subject to road user charges must affix a label to the vehicle that proves they have a valid road user charges licence. Madam Speaker, for this reason, we provide several different ways for people to purchase road user charges. You can purchase in person from agents across the country, or you can directly purchase online from Waka Kotahi. All the standard payment methods will be available to people during the second temporary reduction period, and the Minister is assured that Waka Kotahi has the resources in place to support those people who need help to purchase. Madam Speaker, we're keeping safeguards in place to discourage excessive purchases. The pre-purchase nature of road user charges does create a risk of drivers or owners purchasing excessive amounts. When we first introduced the reductions in April 2022, we put some safeguard measures into the Road User Charges Act. We did this to discourage people from making excessive purchases or abusing the intent of the reduction. Waka Kotahi has been empowered to flag and investigate potential excessive or unreasonable purchases. If it concludes that the purchase was unreasonable, it can invoice purchases at the full or standard rate for the excess. Waka Kotahi's website provides guidance to help guide decisions on what is likely to be an acceptable or reasonable purchase. Individual travel patterns are often unique, and the guidance recognises this. Madam Speaker, passing this bill is a priority. We need to pass this bill because it is a way to provide timely support to many households and businesses across the country. It will deliver real savings for people who own and drive diesel vehicles, and we can implement it quickly. Madam Speaker, we look forward to the debate on this bill. Kia ora tātou.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call on Simeon Brown.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to take a call on the second reading of this piece of legislation. And